I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 751, Assessment at the Paris Police Academy. Alois suddenly shouted, "Do you remember? The instructors in Paris said that the training we received is enough to deal with the real army." Bourget listened to the increasingly clear sound of the Austrian military drums and nodded. "Yes, even if it is the Austrian army, we may not lose. Don't be afraid, just treat them as gang members." "Yes, it's just a gang with more people. The police in Wallonia said so, but from the white hands holding the guns, it can be seen that they actually have no confidence." Bourget remembered something again, looking at the Austrian soldiers vaguely visible in the distance, and said, "The commander said that after this fight, the salary will be tripled." The high bonus immediately diluted everyone's nervousness, and some people even showed an expectant look. The coal and iron mines in Wallonia have brought a lot of wealth here. In addition to enjoying the Rhine River trade, the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce is rich, and it would not even blink an eye to pay the police a few months more salary. Not long after, the rhythmic sound of military drums also sounded in front of the Wallonia police team. Bourget confirmed that the Charleville 1776 flintlock in his hand was loaded with ammunition, and then he heard the superintendent of his police station shouting loudly, "Ready!" He silently said, "God bless," and raised the flintlock. The Austrian skirmishers kept a distance of 3 or 4 steps and attacked very easily. They knew very well that the police could only bully thieves and robbers and would never be able to withstand a blow when facing a real army. They only needed 2 or 3 volleys later, and the seemingly neat formation in front would collapse. The next step was to chase them for a few hundred yards, and then accept their surrender or kill them. Aim. The superintendents in charge of each section of the line formation could not hold back because of nervousness when the Austrians were more than 80 steps away. Shoot. As the thick smoke filled the police ranks, dense lead bullets flew towards the Austrian soldiers like a rainstorm. The Austrian skirmishers laughed in their hearts. As expected, they were just a group of policemen who had never fought in a war. At such a long distance, the flintlock rifles had almost no killing power. The Austrian officers were also very experienced. They immediately ordered the drummers to speed up the rhythm and increase the speed of the soldiers. Those policemen wasted their precious first round of ammunition. Before they finished reloading, they could cause heavy casualties to them with close shooting. Almost in the blink of an eye, thousands of Austrian skirmishers rushed to more than 50 steps in front of the police line. The drumbeats suddenly stopped, and the officers immediately raised their hands and shouted loudly, "Ready! Aim!" What they didn't expect was that the shouts of aim also rang out from the police line on the opposite side. The Austrian officers couldn't help but be a little surprised. It stands to reason that they only advanced 30 steps, and the police on the opposite side should not be able to complete the reloading. Bluffing? Or was the police commander already panicked and gave orders at random? "Shoot!" The Austrian officer waved his hand and shouted, "Shoot!" Almost at the same time, the Walloon police issued the same order. 2,000-meter-long flames burst out, and both the Austrian army and the police heard muffled groans and screams. The Austrian officers looked at the soldiers who were shot and fell beside them in surprise, and they all had the same thought in their minds: how could those policemen reload so quickly? Exclamation mark. Yes, although the Walloon police can only train in the Paris Police Academy for 1 month each year, it is the Paris Police Academy. Even though their assessment standards are much lower than those of regular police academy students, they are enough to match the regular Austrian army. They are even better than many Austrian soldiers who are poorly trained. The superintendents of the Walloon police suddenly recalled the scene of actual combat training in Paris. At that time, they were all complaining about why they, as policemen, had to practice linear formations, dense bayonet formations, and even accompanied by artillery combat. If it weren't for the training allowance, they might not be able to complete the series of complex assessments. It was not until this moment that they realized how meaningful the training they had received before was. Almost like a conditioned reflex, the police superintendents commanding the line array urged loudly, "Reload. Don't stand there, reload immediately." Bourget smelled the blood and his hands were shaking. but he felt like he was back to the first actual combat assessment, and the instructor kept scolding behind him, "You are about to be eliminated, hurry up." The speed of his hands suddenly increased a few points. Just like that assessment. With his firm will, he successfully got the allowance for passing the assessment. After the bullets were pounded, he inserted the cleaning rod back under the barrel, poured the firing powder into the gunpowder chamber, and pulled the flint clip. The voice of the police superintendent rang in his ears. Ready, he raised his flintlock, but unexpectedly found that the Austrians opposite seemed to be still loading powder. At that moment, he suddenly had a strange idea. "I'm afraid they will fail the assessment. Aim. Shoot." The dense flames first spurted out from the line array of the Walloon police. Dozens of Austrian soldiers were knocked to the ground by the oncoming lead bullets as soon as they raised their guns. The others listened to the screams of their comrades, and their eyes were filled with fear. Are the policemen on the other side really? This level of training is a bit too high. Under the repeated urging of the Austrian officers, the Austrian soldiers hurriedly raised their guns to fight back. However, their number was originally less than that of the police, and they were in a scattered formation, so the density of firepower was far less than that of the line formation, so the counterattack only shot and killed a dozen policemen. "Reload. Quick. Hurry up, reload." With the shouts of the commanders of both sides, another round of reloading competition began. But the Austrians were already a beat slower before, and with no difference in training, they would only be slower step by step. The smoke around was blown away by the breeze. Borget looked up while he was pounding the gunpowder. The casualties of the Austrians on the opposite side were obviously heavier than his side, and at the same time, their reloading speed was also slower. A sense of confidence suddenly surged in his heart. It seemed that the instructor at the police academy did not lie to him. Aim. Shoot. The volley of the police line formation took the lead again without any surprise. The Austrian side was filled with blood mist. This time, the police seemed to be more accurate than the last time. A dozen more Austrian soldiers fell. Yes, the situation on the battlefield made many policemen, like Borget, find confidence and perform more stably. After the police fired the fifth volley, some Austrians finally couldn't stand it anymore and retreated in panic. Soon, sporadic escapes turned into a complete rout. The Busek Corps left nearly 200 bodies behind and ran 2 kilometers away until they met Count Radetzky's main force and then stopped. Chapter 752. Making diplomatic preparations. Stupid. You didn't make any preparations before the war and just let the soldiers rush forward recklessly? Count Radetzky glared at Lieutenant Colonel Busek, and then they were defeated by a group of policemen? Busek lowered his head and whispered in defense, "General, the military quality of those policemen is quite high, especially their shooting speed." "Shut up." Count Radetzky scolded. "You are simply a shame to the imperial soldiers." No wonder he lost his temper. Busek really underestimated the enemy. If Busek organized most of the soldiers into a line formation, leaving only 200 or 300 skirmishers in front to harass, it might be possible to fight a draw when the Walloon police lacked the confidence to fight the regular army. But he let all the soldiers rush forward in a skirmish formation, and they were defeated without any suspense under the dense firepower of the opposite infantry line. Count Radetzky looked at his pocket watch, and the hour hand was pointing to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was definitely impossible to reach Wavre today, and it would take time to collect the defeated soldiers of Busek's army. He took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and said to the herald, "Gather the troops. The Croix Corps will be responsible for dealing with those policemen early tomorrow morning. Also, report the situation here to His Royal Highness Prince Coburg." "Yes, General." The next day, inspired by the victory yesterday, the Walloon police once again stubbornly repelled Croix's first attack. This time the latter did not underestimate the enemy, but deployed 3 regiments of troops to form a line array to confront the police head-on, and also sent 3 cavalry squadrons to harass the flanks. Fortunately, the 2 6-pound cannons of the Walloon police were also delivered to the battlefield last night, which surprised the Austrians again. Yes, the Walloon police are organized as artillery police. However, they also suffered nearly 300 casualties in the previous battle. When the Austrian army was preparing to launch a second wave of attacks, the chief police officer of the Walloon region ordered all police to withdraw to the city of Wavre according to the content of command science that he had learned before. No matter how high their training level is, they are only police responsible for public security after all, and lack qualified commanders. And they are facing the Austrian regular army with tens of thousands of troops, and coordinated by cavalry and artillery. But their previous outstanding performance and the appearance of artillery made Count Radetzky alert. He carefully spent a whole day ordering the hussars to repeatedly reconnoiter Wavre, and only after confirming that there were only more than 3,000 policemen in the city did he decide to launch an attack. Southwestern Wallonia. Mons. Chevènement, president of the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce, looked around at the members of the Chamber of Commerce sitting there, raised the newspaper in his hand, and said angrily, "Everyone must have seen that the Flemish people, together with the Austrian government, want to use the army to control Wallonia. Our police bravely repelled them twice north of Wavre, but there were too many Austrian troops, and the police could not defend Wavre." All the members looked at the president with a serious expression. Chevènement slammed the newspaper on the table. Recently, the riots in Wallonia were also planned by them. Fortunately, I received a warning from the French government and transferred the police to Wavre. Otherwise even Mons might have been controlled by the Austrian army at this time. Yes, the French intelligence agency noticed a month and a half ago that there were Dutch-speaking people in Wallonia who were plotting to do something big. Joseph immediately realized that this was probably Austria preparing to attack Wallonia. However, he did not rashly interfere with the situation in Wallonia. Instead, he proposed at the General Staff meeting that the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce ignore the rioters and use all police forces to prevent Austria from sending troops. After weighing the pros and cons, Chevènement accepted the advice of the French intelligence agency, which led to the scene of the Wallonia police sniping the Austrian army. Seeing the anger on the faces of the Chamber of Commerce members, Chevènement continued to speak loudly. "We only have one choice now, that is to ask France for help and ask them to send troops to drive away the Austrians." The Chamber of Commerce members in the hall immediately looked at each other and whispered at the same time. An old man stood up and said, "Mr. Chevènement, this will undermine the status of Wallonia's demilitarized zone." Someone followed and echoed, "Yes, this will easily lead to the French military's military control of Wallonia. The independence of the Chamber of Commerce may no longer exist. The Wallonia Chamber of Commerce has a lot of power here, just like an independent small government, and certainly does not want anyone to control them." Chevènement said in a deep voice, "The moment the Austrian army entered Wallonia, the so-called demilitarized zone no longer existed." He looked meaningfully at the members who raised the objection. "Those guys who speak Dutch and German must be targeting the coal mines and factories in Wallonia. Please don't forget that we all speak French." The noisy hall suddenly became quiet. The members of these chambers of commerce are all major shareholders of coal mines, ironworks and the like in Wallonia. As the number one shareholder in Wallonia, the French government will definitely protect their rights and interests. However, the Austrians who came as troublemakers are likely to take away their assets. Compared with the independent administrative power of Wallonia, their family background is the most important. In other words, if there is no money, the administrative power will soon be lost. After more than 10 seconds of silence, a member of the Chamber of Commerce raised his hand. "I agree to invite the French army to enter Wallonia." Immediately, someone followed suit. "I agree. Let the French come." When the Austrians used to manage Wallonia, the situation was much worse than it is now. That's right, the Flemish will not let us have an easy time. Only the French army can change this situation. A quarter of the Chamber of Commerce was French, and they responded one after another. For a time, the voices of opposition were completely suppressed. Chevènement motioned for everyone to be quiet and waved his hand, saying, "Then, let's vote now. Those who agree to ask the French government for help, please raise your hands." 75 of the 78 commissioners in the hall raised their hands. At noon that day, Joseph received a message from the Walloon Chamber of Commerce through the chat signal machine requesting France to send troops to Wallonia. Of course, the official document was still on the way, but this did not affect his mobilization of troops at all. Only 40 minutes later, the French Southern Netherlands front stationed in Lille set out in the direction of Wavre. At the same time, the Royal 4th Infantry Division of Artois entered a state of forced march. Heading north along the wooden track, the total force reached 23,000. Upper Hesse, Marburg. Count Sager, assistant to the French foreign minister, was denouncing Austria in front of hundreds of nobles for tearing up the agreement, sending troops to the Walloon demilitarized zone, and causing serious damage there. Suddenly, his assistant walked up behind him quietly and whispered a few words to him. Sager nodded, turned around, waved vigorously to the Hessian nobles, and said passionately, "The Walloon Chamber of Commerce formally requested the French army to enter Wallonia 3 days ago to protect their demilitarized zone status." Chapter 753, Divine Soldiers Descend from the Sky. Sager solemnly declared, Austria should bear full responsibility for any consequences in Wallonia. Amid the discussions of the Hesse nobles, Sager ended his speech, left Marburg, and rushed to Würzburg. On the day he left, newspapers in Upper Hesse published the news that Vienna tore up the demilitarized zone agreement, and the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce requested France to intervene. Before coming to Upper Hesse, Sager had traveled day and night to most of the German states, and made no less than 20 speeches, letting all countries know that it was Austria that provoked the war without reason, and France would fight to the end. The day after, the French government publicly accepted the request of the Wallonia region and would send troops to Wallonia. Austria officially declared war on France. On the same day, Britain declared war on France on the grounds that France maliciously destroyed the sugar market. Subsequently, Prussia, Hanover, the Netherlands, and other countries also openly declared war on France. Among them, Prussia and the Netherlands had an alliance treaty with Britain and had to send troops to assist Britain. Thuringia, Lower Hesse, and Tuscany participated in the war against France at the request of Prussia and Austria. 3 days later, diplomatic representatives of these countries signed an agreement in Potsdam, announcing the formation of an anti-French alliance and to jointly maintain the existing order on the European continent. France immediately counterattacked and declared war on all members of the anti-French alliance. The whole of Europe was instantly plunged into the flames of total war. Wavre. The sound of artillery in the north of the city has never stopped since dawn. It has only been 3 days since the Walloon Chamber of Commerce requested France to send troops, but the Walloon police force is obviously unable to hold on. At this time, the north of the city is full of Austrians, and the police rely on the iron ore warehouse in the middle of the city to barely resist. In fact, if Count Radetzky was not worried about destroying Wavre's factory and was somewhat restrained, he might have controlled the entire city at this time. Gaillard, the chief police officer of the Walloon region, frowned when he heard his men report the casualties. After 3 days of fighting, the police casualties were close to 500. For a non-military organization, it is extremely rare to be able to maintain such a ratio of casualties without collapse. What's more terrible is that this morning a team of Austrian hussars raided the police artillery position and destroyed all their cannons. So now the Austrian artillery can approach and shoot without restraint, and the police's defense line is constantly retreating, and casualties are also greatly increased. Gaillard knew that the Walloon police had reached their limit. After discussing with several senior police officers, he said to his deputy, "Order everyone to abandon Wavre. The people of the 4 police station will be responsible for the rear, and the others will immediately retreat to Namur." "Yes, sir." Gaillard raised his head again, looked at the city he had fought for several days, sighed, and said, "I hope the French army can arrive in Namur in time." Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a large number of police officers withdrew from the south side of Wavre and retreated to Namur with a frustrated look amid the rumbling of artillery behind them. However, they had just walked less than 2 kilometers when they heard the sound of horse hooves in front of them. The police lacked combat experience and their morale was low, so they completely ignored the reconnaissance. When Gaillard could see the flag of the Austrian Derner cavalry battalion appearing in the south through a telescope, he realized that he had been intercepted by the enemy. After a while, another mounted police came to report that Austrian infantry had also been found on the east and west sides. Since they had just rushed to the reconnaissance, the enemy was less than 600 steps away from them at this time. Gaillard's heart tightened, and he was about to order to prepare for defense, but he saw the extremely exhausted looks of the soldiers. He shook his head and said to his deputy, "That's it, the boys have tried their best. Raise the white flag. They shouldn't bear more sacrifices at this moment. The sound of the Austrian cavalry's hooves, which had been very neat before, suddenly became chaotic, and then gradually weakened, as if something had stopped them. Then, a mounted policeman galloped over, and said to Gaylord, "Sir, the Austrian infantry on the west side are beginning to gather to the west." Gaylord was startled. He was retreating to the south, but the enemy's infantry was heading west. Didn't this clear the road? He hurriedly said to the cavalry, "Keep on scouting. Quick. Go and have a look further." "Yes, sir." Before the scout cavalry came back, Gaylord heard the sound of horse hooves from the south again. He stood on horseback and looked through a telescope, but was surprised to find that the hundreds of hussars turned west. His way to Namur was completely unblocked. Although he didn't understand what was going on, this was definitely a good opportunity to get rid of the Austrian blockade. At this moment, Gaylord suddenly felt that the sound of horse hooves in the distance was much louder than before. Could it be that the Austrians had reinforced their troops? When he was extremely anxious, the cavalryman ran over quickly, waving his whip, and shouted from a distance, "French! It's the French cavalry. They are attacking the Austrian army." Gaylord's eyes widened immediately. How is this possible? Even if the French army had been waiting at the border of Wallonia and came immediately after receiving the Chamber of Commerce's request, it would take at least a week to arrive. And it has only been 3 days. Why are they here? They should be a small number of cavalry coming to reinforce him. Gaylord's heart was excited, and he shouted to the police, "Everyone cheer up and cooperate with the French cavalry." Although his command level was average, he had not missed the course of command science. He knew very well that cavalry could easily be defeated by the enemy's infantry and cavalry without the cooperation of infantry. At this time, there were more than 10,000 Austrian troops near Wavre, with a full range of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. He had to cover each other with the French cavalry to retreat to a safe place. However, before the police began to move, gunshots and screams were faintly heard from the west. Gaylord was shocked. Could it be that the French cavalry had been defeated? He loudly urged the police to form a team, but the next moment, he saw more than a dozen cavalrymen running past in a mess not far away, and that direction seemed to be heading into the city of Wavre. He hurriedly raised the telescope and immediately saw that the cavalrymen were covered in blood and in a mess, and the grey-green uniforms were Austrians. Soon, the rhythmic sound of military drums came from the west, and more Austrian soldiers were fleeing. Some even ran into the police team in a panic, and were immediately captured by the police. More than 10 minutes later, densely packed white uniforms appeared in Gaylord's field of vision. On the flags of those infantrymen, there was a golden iris and a dolphin. They were the French Royal Infantry. The French soldiers lined up in a very long horizontal column, sweeping across the south of Wavre. Gaylord estimated that there were at least 4,000 or 5,000 of them. On both sides of them, there were large groups of French cavalry wearing bearskin hats, galloping past, driving the nearby Austrian infantry lines forward. This volume ends. Tomorrow, a new volume will begin, and the era of total war will begin on the European continent. Chapter 754 Superior Force. Gaylord still felt like he was dreaming. He had already decided to surrender, but the French army suddenly appeared in front of him. And it was not a small number of cavalry coming to rescue him, but a large main force with complete infantry and artillery. Soon, the police officers also learned about the situation. They hugged each other excitedly and burst into cheers. "It's the French. We are saved. They came so quickly. Long live His Majesty the King. Long live His Majesty. Long live France. Teach those damn Austrians a lesson." Soon, a team of French cavalry confirmed the identity of this police team, and then a French officer came to Gaylord surrounded by hundreds of police officers, and raised his hat to him. "Are you Chief Superintendent Gaylord?" "It's me." Gaylord saluted him excitedly. "You came just in time. Thank you, great French warriors. You have also proved yourself with your excellent performance." The officer gestured behind him. "His Royal Highness the Crown Prince invites you to see him." Gaylord's city defense was very luxurious, with only one stone wall that was 2 people low. Davout was about to abandon the siege and let the soldiers directly defeat the Austrian army behind him, but suddenly he thought of something and said to the herald, "Let me and Philip's company turn to the south and drive those Austrians out of the city." Wei Jining stared at me as I left in a daze, and then turned around to persuade the French prince, "Your Highness, isn't that a bit risky?" Lefebvre nodded and added, "The cavalry squadron will go around to the north to interfere with the enemy's main force retreating to the city to reinforce." Lefebvre squeezed his legs against the horse's belly, his expression full of confidence. "You are worried. I hope you can spend the night in Gaillard tonight." Joseph patted me to comfort me and asked, "Are there no enemy troops on the east and west sides of Gaillard?" When I led the army to participate in the War of the Brabant Uprising, I had fought many times with those armies and was very vague about our weight. Joseph smiled and said, "In reality, less than 3 regiments are enough to recapture Gaillard. However, General Wei Jining's combat style is more cautious. These 500 or so Austrian soldiers could only retreat northward under the fierce firepower, but the French army kept a distance from us to ensure that we would not collapse." Lefebvre was startled. "General, but the Austrian army is less than 10,000 people." "That's what I have been thinking since I was a child." About half an hour ago, the Austrian infantry battalion had reached the top of the city of Gaillard. It is located in the south of Jining. Davout was commanding his soldiers to encircle an Austrian infantry battalion of about 500 people in the rear when the messenger suddenly delivered General Lefebvre's order, asking me to launch a weak attack on the city of Gaillard immediately. Under the pressure of firepower from the opposite side, these Austrian soldiers quietly shouted to open the door and let us retreat from the city. While even fewer people climbed the wall directly, they only needed to step on one person's shoulders to climb down with difficulty. "Yes, Your Highness, you think so too. 5,000 French new troops are enough to deal with us." Wei Jining looked at the crown prince, who was surprisingly old, and hurriedly stepped down to salute respectfully. "It is a great honor to meet you outside. It was you who saved you." The Austrian soldiers who were hiding in front of the battlements and shooting outside the city were immediately thrown into chaos by us, and the gunfire suddenly became stronger. Lefebvre stepped down and said to Wei Jining, "General, do you need the Walloon police to cooperate with you? You don't have nearly 3,000 people who can fight." The former bent down and patted my shoulder. "Thank you for your kindness, but your soldiers are enough to defeat the enemy. They have been in poor health for several days. Let's retreat and rest first." What's more, Count Radetzky's troops were divided into the city and outside the city, which gave Lefebvre the opportunity to defeat them one by one. "Your Highness, the Crown Prince is here too. You personally command the frontal retreat." Joseph ordered, "Let the 7th Skirmisher Regiment slowly maneuver to the west of the city and launch a surprise attack from here." I pointed to the north side of Gaillard on the map. "My main force should still be in the north of the city. About 2 or 8 regiments attacked Gaillard this morning." Joseph nodded and looked at Lefebvre. "The number of enemies is small. We should launch an immediate retreat and take back the city before we completely control Gaillard." On the opposite side were the legions recruited by Austria in the Flemish region, or the Dutch army. The combat effectiveness of those Dutch-speaking soldiers was at the bottom of the Austrian army. Lefebvre saluted the Crown Prince, jumped off his horse, and signaled several officers beside him to follow me to the rear line. There are only about 6,000 people in 4 regiments. Such a small force actually launched an active retreat against the Austrian army. The old army such as the Rethel Legion marched faster, and the Royal 7th Infantry Division set out from Artois, so we have to wait until tomorrow or the day before tomorrow to arrive. Just then, the sound of slow drums rang out in Davout's Legion, and 5 columns of 100 people quickly rushed towards the city of Gaillard. As he was speaking, Xord came over and bowed, saying, "Your Highness, Chief Superintendent Lefebvre is here." "Very bad, that's it." Joseph nodded in return and turned the map to me. "Mr. Lefebvre, please tell me about the movements of Weijin." Under a large elm tree, Joseph looked at the map on the wooden frame and said to Lefebvre, "Let Major Davout's regiment bypass the Walloon police and continue to advance eastward. We have too few cavalry, and he must try his best to prevent the Austrian army from escaping back to Wavre. You left Leperk to continue fighting outside the city, but I only have less than 600 people, and may not have. At most you have not been attacked from those 2 directions, Your Highness. It only took 15 minutes for the 2 companies under Davout's command to maneuver in a column formation to the southeast side of Wiegen, and quickly deployed into a line formation in front, completing the squeezing of the Austrian infantry battalion to the north. Yes, His Highness is always with his army. Be careful not to fight too hard, leaving us a little hope. At this time, those who arrived at Gélud were all elites of the direct corps. When Jining thought that the French crown prince would ask me about military affairs. He was stunned for a moment, then hurried to the map. But, Your Highness. Yes, Commander. Davout's regiment was basically composed of graduates from the 7th term of the Paris Police Academy, and was not part of the future Royal First Guards Corps. Whether in terms of training, morale or weapons and equipment, it was absolutely overwhelming the Austrians on the opposite side. The enemy commander is Count Radetzky. My troops are at most 10,000 people, or even less. You know, your cavalry was driven by the enemy's hussars, and it is difficult to obtain more detailed intelligence. South of Wavre, Febvre said without hesitation. How many soldiers did you bring? It should not be tens of thousands, right? Le Wavre smiled. There are probably less than 4 regiments that arrived at Gélud. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 755 Savior. The Austrian soldiers in the city were shocked, but their own people blocked their sight, and even stepped on their heads by the fleeing soldiers who jumped from the wall, so they could not shoot effectively for a while. In this moment of chaos, several columns of the French army had already rushed to the vicinity of the city wall. The Austrian officer was so anxious that he shouted desperately, "Idiots, get out of the way. Shoot, shoot, repel them." At his command, gunshots finally rang out behind the battlements of the city wall, and a dozen French soldiers fell to the ground in response. However, after only a few seconds, they rubbed the position where they were shot, climbed up again, and then picked up their guns, and continued to shout and stride towards the city wall. After more than a year of preparation, the French Army's direct corps is now fully equipped with bulletproof inserts, especially the soldiers in the front row, who are equipped with heavy inserts. As long as you are not hit in the head and neck, you will not be in danger of life if you are shot at a distance of 40 steps. The resurrection of the French army made the Austrian soldiers even more panicked, and the shooting from the city became increasingly sparse. The 2 fastest French columns had already arrived at the foot of the city. Some soldiers dispersed to suppress the shooting, while others climbed up the low city wall. Lefebvre was still mobilizing artillery to bombard the city wall, but suddenly noticed that the Austrian army on the east side began to get chaotic. A moment later, a messenger came on horseback and shouted to him, "Report to the general, Major Davout has entered the city." Lefebvre smiled and shook his head. Davout, this young man, was always so fierce in fighting. He actually broke through the enemy's defense without artillery. He then ordered the troops to move eastward and enter Wavre through the gap created by Davout. The bodies of Austrian soldiers could be seen everywhere in the city, but the damage to the buildings was not serious. At this time, all the residents were hiding at home and dared not come out. The streets seemed very quiet. Lefebvre was just thinking about where the enemy's defense focus should be when another messenger came to report that Davout had occupied the iron ore warehouse in the middle of the city. In the temporary French headquarters outside Wavre, Gélud looked at the French crown prince in surprise. "Your Highness, you mean that the Flemish riots in Landen, Art and other places have subsided?" Joseph said calmly, "I sent people to deal with it when I entered the Walloon area. According to the time, it should be fine now." Gélud hurriedly said, "But this kind of thing really shouldn't disperse your precious troops." Joseph smiled and shook his head. "It's just 3 companies, you don't need to worry." Yes, Joseph only sent more than 300 soldiers to basically stabilize the situation in Walloon. This is also the reason why he dared to let the Walloon Chamber of Commerce ignore the riots and concentrate all the police to stop the Austrian army. In accordance with Joseph's instructions, the Walloon Chamber of Commerce asked officials from various cities to evacuate in advance to avoid being damaged by the riots. When the French army arrived, they summoned local citizens and followed the army to launch a siege on the rioters. The Walloons also hated the Flemish people who created the riots. As long as the French army suppressed the rioters with firepower in front, they would rush up like wild beasts and tear the rioters to pieces. Especially when the rioters did not wait for the support of the Austrian army, but heard that the French army had entered the Walloon region, they lost their will to resist. In this situation, 60 or 70 French soldiers can solve the riots in a city. In fact, Joseph had another purpose for such an arrangement, which was to establish the prestige of the French army in the Walloon region. Under the leadership of the French soldiers, the citizens of Walloon drove away the damn rioters and resumed their peaceful lives. To them, the French soldiers were heroes and saviors. If someone suggested that the Walloon region be incorporated into France at this time, it would definitely be unanimously agreed by everyone. Gaillard was talking to the Crown Prince about how to deal with the riots when he saw an officer knocking on the door and standing at attention to the Crown Prince. "Your Highness, General Lefebvre has already entered Wavre. He said the battle will be over in 2 hours." Gaillard's eyes widened in shock. It was only an hour and a half since the Crown Prince ordered the attack on the Austrian army. You know, it took 10,000 Austrian troops 3 days to barely break into the city when facing 4,000 Walloon policemen. And now the French army is still at a disadvantage in terms of manpower. What kind of terrifying combat power is this? 2 hours later, the city of Wavre gradually returned to peace. Gaillard felt a little unreal. As expected, he took the Walloon policeman into the city to rest before dark. At 6 p.m., as the person who was most familiar with the situation in Wavre, he was invited to attend the French army's combat meeting. In the temporary meeting room, a captain staff officer was introducing the intelligence discovered by the cavalry in front of the map. At present, all the enemy forces in Wavre have been cleared out. The main force of Radetzky's corps still has about 6,000 people and has now retreated northward to the town of Mavrin, 6 kilometers away. Count Radetzky had never expected the French to appear so soon, so the Austrian army in the north of the city was rushing into the city in a mess, but was attacked by Lefebvre and collapsed without much resistance. Radetzky's reaction was relatively fast. He immediately ordered his most elite grenadier battalion and a skirmisher regiment to cover the rear, and as the sky began to darken, he was able to withdraw the main force. However, even so, he lost more than 4,000 troops in Wavre in just half a day. The staff officer continued, according to the estimate of the general staff, Josias's main force will arrive in the town of Mavrin as early as tomorrow afternoon, with a strength of about 30,000. Josias is the name of Prince Coburg. Lefebvre frowned and said to the staff officer in charge of marching dispatch, "When will the 4th Infantry Division arrive?" The latter immediately said, "If nothing unexpected happens, it will arrive in Wavre tomorrow morning." Lefebvre breathed a sigh of relief and looked at Joseph. "Your Highness, the enemy will definitely be eager to retake the city of Wavre. I think we can use Wavre as bait to ambush them. Specifically, let Mr. Gaillard's police force defend the city, and we will deploy our main forces on the southwest side of the town of Mavrin. When Josias' main force goes to Wavre, we will attack from their flank and rear." Davout immediately added, "We can also capture the town of Mavrin at the same time, to cut off the Austrians' retreat." Joseph did not comment, but looked up at the map. According to the marching speed of the Austrian army, Josias's corps should be near Uccle now. Lefebvre nodded subconsciously. "Yes, Your Highness." Joseph narrowed his eyes slightly. "Tell me, if you were Marshal Josias, what would you think our army would do next?" Lefebvre thought for a while and said, "You should think that we should hold on to Wavre. Wavre is the main road on the south side of Brussels. As long as we hold it here, we can stop the Austrian army from continuing to move south to Namur." Joseph nodded. "So, we have to give him a surprise." Chapter 756 Attack. Outside the town of Mavrin, thousands of French soldiers formed several lines and stared at the town with eager eyes. 7 or 8 cannons had been pouring shells at the Austrian army in the town since early morning. Count Radetzky was upset by the sound of the cannons, but he still checked the defense situation in person. As the vanguard of Prince Coburg, he not only failed to capture Wavre, but also had nearly half of his troops destroyed by the French army that suddenly appeared. This town is the only foothold on the north side of Wavre. If it is lost again, the prince will most likely send him to a military court. Fortunately, he still has nearly 6,000 soldiers in his hands, and after most of the day's reconnaissance, he has confirmed that the French army attacking him should be more than 6,000 people. Although the performance of those French troops yesterday was extremely fierce, he believed that, if he devoted all his efforts to defense, it should be enough to delay until the main force of Prince Coburg arrived here tomorrow. After encouraging the soldiers, Count Radetzky returned to the headquarters panting, and ordered the messenger, "Send someone to report the situation here to His Royal Highness." Since yesterday afternoon, this is the third time he has sent someone to ask Prince Coburg for help. South of Brussels, the town of Uccle, the main force of the Austrian southern Netherlands front led by Prince Coburg is slowly moving south. It is nearly 20 kilometers away from Wavre. If nothing unexpected happens, they will arrive there at noon tomorrow. Prince Coburg rode on his horse and frowned to the Chief of Staff Karel von Leberich beside him. How could the French appear in Wavre so quickly? Did they fly here? Austria has ruled the southern Netherlands for more than 80 years, and there are many Flemish people in Wallonia, so it can be said that there are eyes and ears all over Wallonia. So he is very sure that just 4 days ago, no French troops had entered Wallonia, and the French took only 3 days to rush from the border of Lille to Wavre. That is nearly 6 days of journey under normal circumstances. Leberich said, "Marshal, perhaps it is just a French cavalry. If it is pure cavalry without supplies, it is understandable that they can reach this marching speed." Prince Coburg glanced at him. General Radetzky's report said that the French also carried cannons. He waved his hand again. After all, his reconnaissance was not careful enough, and he failed to discover the French army in advance. Otherwise, he would not have been beaten so badly. The Chief of Staff nodded. "Yes, Marshal. General Radetzky has a military advantage." As the two were talking, an officer came over and handed an urgent report to Prince Coburg's attendant. "Marshal, this is what Count Radetzky just sent." Prince Coburg glanced at the report and handed it to Leberich. "The French are still attacking Radetzky's corps." The latter took the report and saw that it was basically Count Radetzky's request for help. Obviously, the French army put him under great pressure. He looked at the prince and said, "The French should want to capture the town of Mavrony to expand the defense of Wavre. Do you think we should send a cavalry battalion to support it?" Prince Coburg thought for a moment and shook his head. "Cavalry alone is not enough. The French were obviously dazzled by yesterday's successful raid, so now we have a good opportunity." "What do you mean?" "The French have put all their forces into the siege of the town of Mavrony, so now Wavre's defense must be very empty. We should try our best to eliminate them near the town of Mavrony, so that we can easily get Wavre." Based on the intelligence he had obtained previously, he knew that there were more than 20,000 French troops entering the Wallonia region. Obviously, only their vanguard troops have arrived at Wavre. If these people hold on to Wavre until their main force arrives, the Austrian army will face a difficult siege. Even if the Austrian army has an absolute advantage in manpower, it is likely to be blocked north of Wavre. But now the French have rashly left Wavre to attack the Radetzky corps, and he must seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Prince Coburg immediately ordered, "Let General Gruber lead the Pilsen Corps, the Grenadiers Battalion, and all the cavalry to the town of Mavrony as quickly as possible. And then, depending on the situation, surround the French troops there, or directly capture Wavre." The Pilsen Corps was the only unit in his army that was brought from Austria, and the Grenadier Battalion was even more elite, and these were soldiers who could march at high speeds. As a Prince of Thuringia, he was able to get the position of Marshal in the Austrian army, which showed that he did have certain abilities in military command. At this time, he very decisively sent all the elite troops forward. Soon, more than 6,000 Austrian infantry and 4,000 cavalry began to break away from the main force and rushed south at a very fast speed. Prince Coburg watched the assault force disappear from his sight and then turned to Leberich. "Order the entire army to speed up the march. We must arrive in Wavre before dark. If General Gruber is delayed by the French, we can launch an attack on Wavre tomorrow morning." With 40,000 troops at his command, his mind was now full of thoughts on how to capture Wavre as quickly as possible, and how to march into Namur next, but he did not consider at all that his opponent had no intention of defending from the very beginning. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Grubber's assault force had arrived 4 kilometers north of the town of Mavrin. The main force of Prince Coburg was nearly 7 kilometers away from them. Prince Coburg kept whipping the war horse under his crotch with a whip, and the horse almost kept trotting. It can be predicted that after the journey is over today, it will take at least a week of rest to recover its strength. At this moment, a melodious trumpet sounded suddenly from the west. Prince Coburg frowned immediately, and before he could ask, a hussar galloped over and shouted at him nervously, "French." A large number of French troops were found on the west, at least more than 10,000 people. Prince Coburg was stunned. Count Radetzky had 6,000 French troops, so where did these 10,000 people come from? But he had no time to think about it, and hurriedly shouted to Liberic, "Quick! Order the entire army to gather and switch to a defensive formation." His order was quickly passed down, and the Austrian soldiers began to line up in a hurry, but for a while most of the officers had not figured out where the enemy would attack from. The most fatal thing was that Prince Coburg had previously required the entire army to rush to Wavre as quickly as possible, resulting in a very large gap between the well-trained corps and the under-trained corps. Looking down from the sky at this time, the main force of the Austrian army was a thin line 5 kilometers long, and a French unit was stabbing straight at the waist of this thin line from 3 kilometers away. Chapter 757. This is a surprise. 9 kilometers south of Uccle, French soldiers in white uniforms were lining up in an orderly manner. What was a little strange was that the clothes of the more than 4,000 soldiers on the northernmost side were light grey, which was obviously the uniform of the Walloon police. Yes, the French army that was intimidating Count Radetzky outside the town of Mavrin was actually the Walloon police in French uniforms. They were no longer able to continue fighting after yesterday's defeat, but they could still stand there in line. This was also the reason why Count Radetzky kept reporting to Prince Coburg that the main force of the French army was ready to attack the town of Mavrin at any time. Joseph used this method to hide more than 4,000 French soldiers. Then he ordered the Royal 4th Infantry Division to march overnight. The 4th Division finally arrived in Wavre at 3 o'clock in the morning. Even such a top-notch force in Europe had thousands of people falling behind after marching for half a night. This morning, Joseph asked Lefebvre to lead 13,000 soldiers who still had strength to quickly march north and launch an active attack on Prince Coburg's troops. From Prince Coburg's point of view, the 6,000 French troops in the Wavre area were besieging Count Radetzky, and he should have maintained a fierce offensive and occupied Wavre in one fell swoop. He never thought that he would suddenly be attacked by tens of thousands of French troops. Lefebvre's eyes swept across the faces of the soldiers with dark circles under their eyes and tired expressions, and he sighed in his heart. These guys traveled 25 kilometers during the day yesterday, walked 8 kilometers overnight, and only slept for 4 hours at night. This morning, they continued to walk 9 kilometers to get here. You can imagine how much physical exhaustion they had. Waving his whip, he galloped past the soldiers and shouted, "Yes, I know everyone is very tired, and perhaps even standing like this is a little strenuous." He turned sideways and pointed his whip to the east, but the enemy is equally exhausted. In order to reinforce the Radetzky Corps, they have been marching since this morning, and now even their formation has become extremely messy. I want you to hold on and let those Austrians know what a real man is. Let them watch in horror how you crush them completely with your iron will. He drew out his sword suddenly, raised it above his head, and said proudly, "You are the Guards Corps of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. You are the best soldiers on the European continent. You will overcome everything." Yes, although it has been reorganized into the Royal 4th Corps, the soldiers are proud of the Guards Corps and still call themselves that in private. When they heard the Guards Corps, the soldiers immediately raised their heads, and excitement and enthusiasm replaced the previous fatigue in their eyes. Lefebvre turned his horse's head and rushed towards the Austrian army in the east, in the name of the Crown Prince. Defeat them. Tens of thousands of soldiers immediately followed with a thunderous roar, in the name of the Crown Prince. Their bodies seemed to have forgotten their fatigue, and they marched to the beat of the drums, striding towards Prince Coburg. Of course, this was also the result of their daily ultra-high-intensity physical training. Otherwise, no matter how motivated they were, it would be useless if their bodies could not hold on. but the French new army would practice 5-kilometer weighted running at any time, so they could still squeeze out some physical strength at this time. In comparison, the Austrian soldiers only carried out a forced march of less than 10 kilometers this morning, and their physical strength had been almost exhausted. Prince Coburg's response was timely. In the process of the French army rushing through the last 3 kilometers, he had gathered 5 infantry regiments and completed the formation on the west side. Lefebvre had no choice. The terrain around Brussels was flat, and 3 kilometers was the shortest distance that could not be discovered by the Austrian reconnaissance cavalry. In fact, if Prince Coburg was not in a hurry to get on the road, he would have to maintain a distance of at least 6 kilometers to avoid being discovered. But with the degree of chaos caused by the Austrian army's forced march, 3 kilometers was enough to hide. The first to attack the Austrian army were not Lefebvre's cavalry or infantry, but artillery. Although Joseph did not bring any cavalry artillery this time in order not to disperse the offensive forces on the Rhine River line, the marching speed of the Royal Infantry Artillery Battalion was not slow at all. 10 6-pound cannons began to fire 500 steps away from the Austrian army. This is almost the maximum effective range of these guns. However, at this time, there were Austrian soldiers running around everywhere in front. With the shooting level of the Royal Artillery Battalion, there was no need to worry about hitting the target. As the shells passed by one after another, screams were heard in the Austrian army. In addition to the more than 7,000 people who had completed the formation, the other soldiers who were still gathering towards the military flag were more chaotic due to the lack of officer restraint and the killing of artillery shells. On the side of Prince Coburg, most of the artillery was still in the back of the team, and only 3 guns could fight back at this time. More than 10 minutes later, 12 French infantry columns appeared in front of the Austrian infantry line under the cover of the skirmisher battalion, and began to accelerate the charge. "Stand still!" the Austrian officers shouted desperately, but the shooting of more than 600 French skirmishers alone caused their line formation to waver. Then, the French columns arrived at a position about 100 steps away from the line formation, stopped, and began to deploy into horizontal columns. In just half a minute, several horizontal columns over 100 meters long appeared in front of the Austrian infantry line. At the same time, the skirmishers tacitly filled in the spaces between the horizontal columns to make up for the firepower gaps. Forward. Following the officer's order, a column of 6,000 French infantrymen followed the sound of military drums and pressed towards the opposite line formation. When the two sides were 60 steps apart, the Austrian army finally couldn't hold back and took the lead in launching a volley. 30 or 40 French soldiers were hit by bullets, but under the protection of bulletproof inserts, less than 10 people were actually injured. The rhythm of the French military drums also accelerated, and the column rushed forward 12 steps, and then, at the order of the officers, they raised their percussion guns at the same time. Aim, shoot. Dense flames enveloped the entire column. Due to the closer distance and the higher shooting level of the French army, the Austrian line formation was immediately covered with blood and flesh, and hundreds of people fell to the ground. Load. In fact, there was no need for officers to order at all. The French soldiers were almost driven by muscle memory, and the actions of raising the gun, loading the powder, and pestling were quickly performed. Because they were more skilled in loading, and the percussion gun had fewer steps to load, the Austrians finished loading, and just raised their guns, and the French followed closely, and aimed at them. You know, they just took 12 more steps. The two sides fired 2 or 3 seconds apart, and tens of thousands of lead bullets crossed each other. The bulletproof inserts once again showed their great value. More than 150 Austrians were shot dead, while the French only had about 40 casualties. Chapter 758, First Battle Victory. The extremely unfair exchange of fire lasted for 6 rounds. To be precise, the French fired 6 rounds of volleys, while the other side fired only 4 rounds. Coupled with the fierce bombardment of the French artillery, a large number of gaps soon appeared in the Austrian line formation. I don't know who was the first to turn around and run away, which immediately attracted the surrounding Austrian soldiers to run with him. In just a few minutes, the rout spread to the entire infantry line. Prince Coburg hurriedly ordered the 2nd Infantry Line behind to take over, but he didn't expect that the French horizontal column immediately gathered into more than a dozen columns, passed through the fleeing Austrian soldiers, and rushed directly to the Austrian line formation behind. The Austrian soldiers behind were completely unprepared. Until the French column had been deployed, many of them were still executing the previous order, moving forward to take over the defense line of the defeated soldiers. And more soldiers stopped and prepared to counterattack. So, at this time, a crooked infantry line appeared in front of the French army. The battle process was no suspense. The neat Austrian infantry lines could not withstand the fierce attack of the French Royal Corps, not to mention the messy formation. In less than 20 minutes, the infantry line that Prince Coburg had just organized collapsed again. Prince Coburg originally wanted to hold on until the elite troops led by Grubber withdrew. He gave Grubber a retreat order as soon as he discovered the French army, but he did not expect that the French army was so fierce that he collapsed in an hour and a half. A dozen guards put Prince Coburg on the horse without saying anything and covered him to retreat towards Brussels. However, they had just run 2 or 3 kilometers when they saw chaos in front of them. It should be that Davidovich's Dutch corps was also attacked. Prince Coburg suddenly felt black in front of his eyes. I don't know where the French got so many troops from. Now Brussels may be in danger. He hurriedly ordered to turn southeast and run towards Leuven. He had no idea that there were only 4 cavalry companies, or more than 450 people, attacking the Dutch corps, all the cavalry that Joseph brought to the southern Netherlands. When Prince Coburg's main force was attacked, he immediately ordered the Dutch to move closer to him. The quality of the Dutch corps was worse than that of the Austrian army. After Davidovich urged them to speed up their march, they soon scattered into more than a dozen pieces. When the French cavalry appeared, the Dutch immediately panicked and began to flee in all directions without organizing any defense. The fleeing soldiers spread the news that the French launched a general attack to more people. In this way, Davidovich's vanguard of nearly 10,000 soldiers was driven around by 4 cavalry companies. This also gave Prince Coburg the wrong information, making him mistakenly believe that the Dutch army behind him also encountered a large number of French troops, so he decided to flee to Leuven. On the other side, Lefebvre looked at the Austrian soldiers running around like headless flies, and finally breathed a sigh of relief, and at the same time, admired the decision of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. If he followed his plan to defend Wavre, even if it went very smoothly, he should be fighting with the Austrian army that had completed its assembly. He was confident that he could command 20,000 French troops to defeat the more than 40,000 Austrian-Dutch coalition forces, but if he carried out a positional war, as long as Prince Coburg did not make any mistakes, the battle would have to last at least a week or even longer. At the moment, including the march, he defeated the Austrian-Dutch coalition forces in just half a day. He immediately said to the herald, "Let Renault's regiment stay to pursue the defeated enemy, and the others will gather immediately and return to Wavre." Yes, General. Lefebvre knew that there were only less than 2,000 French troops in Wavre, and they were all exhausted soldiers, as well as 4,000 Wallonia police. Prince Coburg's vanguard might not return to help here, but continue to risk attacking Wavre. So at the moment, the safest thing for Lefebvre to do was to lead his main force back to Wavre immediately. Although this might allow many Austrian troops to escape, it would at least block the Austrian army attacking Wavre and ensure Wavre's safety. When Lefebvre's main force had gone less than 4 kilometers to the south, the scout cavalry suddenly reported to him that there were nearly 10,000 Austrian troops coming towards him. 5 hours later, Lefebvre finally defeated the 9,000 Austrian troops led by Grubber with great difficulty. The reason why the battle took so long was that the Austrian army had a large number of cavalry, but Lefebvre had no cavalry. Once Grubber fell into a disadvantage, he would use cavalry to harass from behind, which gave Lefebvre a headache. It was not until the 4 cavalry companies attacking the Dutch corps came to reinforce that the battle was finally over. This was also due to the credit of the 1,000 Dutch cavalry under Grubber. If they had not suddenly fled and given up the flank of the Austrian cavalry, the battle would probably have lasted until tomorrow. Wavre. In a room in the Chamber of Commerce's administrative building, Joseph was reading the military report sent by the Rhine Front Army. He raised his hand and gestured to Emin. "Please make me a cup of tea." Thank you. Xord and Demon looked at each other, then looked out the window anxiously, and bowed to Joseph and said, Your Highness, perhaps you should go to Namur or Mons first, it will be safer there. No wonder he was so anxious. At this time, there were only 300 guards of the Crown Prince in Wavre, and 2,000 soldiers who were too tired to fight, because of the journey. If Lefebvre failed to defeat the main force of Prince Coburg, when the Austrian army went south, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince would be in a very dangerous situation. Joseph took the teacup from Emin and smiled. I have absolute confidence in my army. He didn't have to play with his heartbeat. For one thing, he knew the level of the Austrian-Dutch coalition forces, especially the 20,000 Dutch troops, which might not be able to defeat the 3,000 French new troops. He had made so many arrangements to confuse Prince Coburg. With Lefebvre launching a surprise attack, victory was basically a sure thing. Secondly, he also scattered a lot of reconnaissance cavalry around Wavre. If the Austrian army really approached Wavre, he would have time to leave immediately. Anyway, there were no enemy troops in the southwest. Just when Xode wanted to persuade him again, an officer pushed the door open excitedly, saluted Joseph and said, Your Highness, General Lefebvre has won. The general defeated the Austrian army south of the town of Uccle, and Josias led about 5,000 defeated troops to flee to Leuven. Ludovic's Dutch corps fled back to Brussels. General Lefebvre also defeated the Grubber Corps on the way back to Wavre. A total of more than 4,000 people were killed and captured. Joseph looked at the clock in surprise. It was just 5:30. He thought the battle would last at least until the day after tomorrow, but he didn't expect it to be won so quickly. Chapter 759, Fighting alongside the Crown Prince. According to Joseph's original plan, Lefebvre was going to lead his army to fight a decisive battle with the main force of Prince Coburg in the south of Uccle. He and Lefebvre and others believed that the Austrian army would be unprepared, but they could still do the basic marching rules and peripheral warnings. Who knew that Prince Coburg, who was confident of his huge military advantage, didn't care about these things at all. The result was that Lefebvre was like attacking a group of people on a picnic and defeated them at a very fast speed. Joseph put the cup he had just received on the table and asked the officer who came to report the situation, Where is General Lefebvre now? The general should have arrived near the town of Mavrin, Your Highness. Joseph stood up and waved to Xord. Let's go to the town of Mavrin immediately. The latter was shocked and stopped him. Your Highness, it will be dark soon. Let's go tomorrow. Joseph pushed his hand away and signaled Emin to take his coat. My dear captain of the guard, this is a military mission. Please gather the guard as soon as possible. The reason why he took the risk to stay in Wavre was to inspire the morale of the soldiers. You know, Wavre is only 9 kilometers away from the place where Lefebvre defeated Prince Coburg, which is completely within the front line. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is not afraid of danger and goes to the front line with everyone. How can the soldiers not be in high spirits and full of fighting spirit? If Franz II could also come to the southern Netherlands to supervise the battle, even if the Austrian army could not defeat the French army, it would definitely grit its teeth and hold out for 10 days or half a month in front of His Majesty the Emperor, instead of being defeated in one afternoon. Joseph had already taken the necessary risks, and now he had to maximize the effects. 7 o'clock in the evening. Southwest of the town of Mavrin. In the temporary camp of the French army led by Lefebvre, the soldiers had finished their dinner and were tidying up their blankets in the moonlight, preparing to rest. At this moment, a short bugle sounded in the camp, and then the company commanders received the order and began to urge everyone to light torches excitedly. More than 10 minutes later, the entire camp was lit up. The wounded camp was the first to see the ceremonial flag of the Crown Prince. The wounded got up excitedly and looked behind the flag. The neat white cavalry officer uniform and the handsome and young face were none other than His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. A soldier with an injured arm stood at attention excitedly, holding his chest high and shouting. Immediately, the whole camp was filled with excited and proud shouts. Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. It's so late. His Royal Highness is still visiting us. It's really His Royal Highness the Crown Prince who has come. In the name of the Crown Prince. They had indeed heard that the Crown Prince was commanding the rear army in Wavre, but now they saw His Royal Highness coming to visit them with their own eyes, and they were extremely moved. It turned out that His Royal Highness had always fought side by side with them. His injuries were not in vain. No, these scars were the supreme honor. Joseph hurriedly motioned for everyone to lie back on the stretcher, and then stretched out his hand to the soldier closest to him. The soldier didn't quite understand, and while he was stunned, he found that the Crown Prince pulled up his hand and shook it hard. He felt a warmth from his palm, and his nose suddenly felt sour. "Your Highness, France thanks you for your bravery and dedication." Joseph shook his hand again, and said in a gentle tone, "I hope you can recover as soon as possible." "Yes, Your Highness." The wounded stood at attention, too excited to speak. "You." Joseph nodded, patted his arm, indicating that he understood what he meant, and helped him sit back on the stretcher. Then he walked to the next wounded, and shook hands with him vigorously. In this era, where the nobility and civilians are clearly divided, ordinary soldiers have never experienced, or even heard of such things. After the Crown Prince shook hands with them, they felt that their wounds were not as painful as before. After shaking hands with all the wounded one by one, Joseph gave a brief speech, then went to the next camp, and began to comfort the soldiers of the infantry regiment. Soon, the whole camp was excited, and the soldiers shouted "Long live His Royal Highness the Dauphin," as if it was a festival. It was not until late at night that Joseph showed himself to tens of thousands of soldiers, and then he returned to Lefebvre's officer tent tiredly. Lefebvre also seemed very excited. He asked his servants to bring wine to the Dauphin. This was a military supply, and every soldier had it. Tea was a luxury in the army, and then stood at attention and said, "Your Highness, although the soldiers are very tired, I think the morale of the Radetzky Corps should be even lower. Tomorrow we just need to launch an attack and we can quickly capture the town of Mavrin." He just saw the soldiers howling for a fight, and their morale was so high that it didn't look like they had been marching continuously and fighting for most of the day. Not to mention tomorrow, even if they were asked to attack the town of Mavrin now, they would probably be able to take it down immediately. Joseph looked at the map and waved his hand, saying, "Radetzky's 6,000 men can be eliminated at any time, but it is better to keep them now." Lefebvre immediately understood. "You mean, Josias may send someone to rescue him, and we can ambush the reinforcement?" "Yes." Joseph nodded. "In fact, what I'm most worried about is that he will run back to Brussels." Lefebvre was stunned. "Your Highness, if he goes back, it doesn't seem to have any impact." Joseph smiled at him and said, "It will affect our capture of Brussels." Lefebvre felt a little dizzy. He originally thought that defeating Prince Coburg's troops and ensuring the safety of Wallonia would be the best situation, but he didn't expect that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had already set his sights on the Flemish region. Most of Brussels belongs to the Flemish region, and only a little bit in the south is within the scope of Wallonia. Lefebvre hesitated and said, "Your Highness, the southern Netherlands front is mainly responsible for strategic defense. Is it right to launch a large-scale active attack like this?" Joseph smiled and said, "If we make the enemy unable to attack, then our defensive goal will definitely be foolproof." Attacking Brussels was indeed not in his original plan, but this time he unexpectedly and quickly defeated the main force of Prince Coburg, and now there is a rare opportunity in the southern Netherlands. This gave him a new idea. There are no Austrian troops in Brussels anymore, only Davidovich's 25,000 Dutch corps. Oh, there may not be so many now. After all, they were defeated once by 4 cavalry companies this afternoon. Joseph is very clear about the combat effectiveness of the Dutch army, which is definitely the bottom level in Europe. In other words, the defense of Brussels is unprecedentedly weak at this time. When the old army such as the Artois Corps and the Rethel Corps arrive in Wavre, he will have 23,000 soldiers in his hands, and it is very likely to capture Brussels. Chapter 760 Traitor. Lefebvre hurriedly advised, "Your Highness, if we are blocked near Brussels, even if it is only half a month, Austrian and Prussian reinforcement will arrive. Even Britain has recently landed 20,000 troops in Utrecht." Utrecht is a province in the central Netherlands, only 140 kilometers away from Brussels. At the same time, Gelden, as an important Prussian stronghold on the west bank of the Rhine, has 70,000 to 80,000 troops stationed there. It is only more than 170 kilometers from there to Brussels. There are more anti-French coalition troops farther away. If Brussels is attacked by the French army, the coalition forces may mobilize a large number of troops to encircle and suppress the French southern Netherlands front. At that time, the more than 20,000 people here will definitely not be able to resist. Therefore, a confrontation with the enemy between Brussels and Wavre is most in line with the strategic deployment decided by the General Staff at the beginning. Joseph nodded. You are right. But have you ever considered, if the British troops in Utrecht do not reinforce Brussels, where will they go? It should be Gelden. Lefebvre said. Yes, but in that case General Berthier will face more enemy forces. Lefebvre's eyes suddenly lit up. I understand, Your Highness. So the Rhine Corps should take the lead in launching an attack. This will prevent the enemy from reinforcing Brussels. Joseph shook his head and said, no, on the contrary, Brussels is the site used to contain the enemy. We must create opportunities for General Berthier to advance the front line to the west bank of the Rhine. This will enable our army to gain the greatest strategic advantage. Lefebvre still tried his best to dissuade, Your Highness. If the direction of the southern Netherlands is lost, the enemy will be able to go south along Lille, and then head straight for Paris perhaps. You can first mobilize some troops from the Rhine front to assist in the defense of the southern Netherlands. His worries were not unnecessary. The Rhine River is lined with small German states. Even if the French army occupied the west bank of the Rhine, it would be an acceptable loss for Austria and Prussia, the two main forces of the anti-French alliance. But if the coalition forces entered Lille, Paris would be greatly threatened. If we transfer troops back from General Berthier, it will weaken our offensive in the Rhine direction, so that neither side can gain an advantage. Joseph pointed to his feet. You probably forgot that we can get troops locally in Wallonia. There is a large population here, but there has never been a large-scale conscription, so it should not be too difficult to recruit 10,000 troops. Together with the Walloon police force, our total force here will reach about 40,000. Lefebvre sighed. Your Highness, even if there are 40,000 soldiers, it may still not be enough. Moreover, it is difficult to count on the combat effectiveness of the new recruits. Joseph nodded. If the enemy mobilizes more than 60,000 troops, I will consider withdrawing troops from Berthier to the southern Netherlands. As for the new recruits, they can also play a huge role, as long as they are used properly. Lefebvre said, Your Highness, forgive me for being blunt, it is still too risky to defend 60,000 enemy troops with 40,000 troops. Joseph smiled. Do you know the backslope tactics? Lefebvre recalled all the military courses he had taken, and shook his head. Your Highness, I have never heard of this term. This is a tactic that can help us defend the southern Netherlands. The backslope tactics that Joseph mentioned is exactly the famous skill of the Duke of Wellington in history. Wellington relied on this tactic at Waterloo to block the fierce attacks of Napoleon's old guards and cavalry with inferior forces, and finally help the British win the war. At present, the Duke of Wellington is still very young and has not created the famous backslope tactics. Joseph was not polite and applied for an original patent one step ahead. He believed that, as long as he found a suitable battlefield, it would be absolutely no problem to use 40,000 soldiers to hold back 60,000 Prussian-British coalition forces. You know, at present, whether it is the British army or the Prussian army, the offensive capabilities are far inferior to those of the old guards of the Emperor. Even the defense line that the old guards could not tear open is even more impossible for them to handle. What's more, Joseph still has two of the most elite Royal Artillery battalions in France. If the gun positions are set up on the high ground, the defensive effect can even exceed that of 10,000 infantry. That night, Joseph's order was sent to Lille, and it was passed to Berthier stationed in Luxembourg through the CHAP signal machine. The content of the order was very simple, allowing Berthier to temporarily slow down the pace of the attack and give the enemy on the opposite side the illusion that the French army was no longer able to continue the attack on the Rhine line. After the enemy transferred its troops to the southern Netherlands, they took the opportunity to concentrate their forces to capture Trier and then surround the most important Koblenz fortress in the middle section of the Rhine. By then, the entire European war situation will be turned upside down. At noon the next day, Joseph went to the artillery battalion and prepared to have lunch with the soldiers. When he was escorted by the guards, passing by several heavily guarded tents, the curtain of one of the tents was suddenly opened from the inside, and a middle-aged man with sparse eyebrows, small eyes, and slightly drooping cheeks came out. Ignoring the scolding of the soldiers around him, the man bowed to Joseph and said loudly in French with an accent, "Thank God, I can see you here, Your Highness, the noble and brave Crown Prince. Hey, don't push me. I just want to say a few words." He desperately used his hands to resist the soldiers and continued to say to Joseph, "Your Highness, I'm the Lieutenant Colonel of the Perrin Infantry Regiment. I have always admired you and hope you can give me a chance to serve you." Joseph frowned and looked at his clothes, which were Austrian military uniforms. And he said he was from the Perrin Infantry Regiment, so he should be Flemish. Joseph suddenly thought of something, pulled the reins, turned around and said, "What's your name?" "Theoden Franz van Schaik, Your Highness, that's my name." Joseph nodded. "Lieutenant Colonel Schaik, can you convince the captured Austrian soldiers to obey my command?" Of course. Schaik's eyes showed just the right amount of flattery. "They will be more loyal than your own army." Joseph smiled and said to Lefebvre beside him, "Please take him to the prisoner camp. Maybe we can add some Flemish soldiers." At this moment, a man with dry cheeks, very tall stature, about 50 years old, came out of the tent next to him. The man took advantage of the soldiers' inattention and kicked Shaker, shouting angrily, "Damn bastard. How dare you shamelessly betray the southern Netherlands." Joseph asked the soldiers to hold the man down, jumped off his horse, looked at him and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm the commander of the Antwerp Corps, William Weigel van Tine." Chapter 761 Flemish Republic. Seeing that Tine was controlled, Schaik got up from the ground, walked around him fearfully, and said to Joseph with a flattering smile, "Dear Prince, please give me 2 days, and your Flemish corps will be able to fight for you on the battlefield." Tine snorted coldly, "Humph, as long as I'm still here, no Flemish will work for the French." Joseph glanced at him and said to Schaik, "Is this Mr. Tine very influential in your army?" "Yes." The latter nodded subconsciously and immediately shook his head. "Ah, no, Your Highness. You know, General Tine's family will pay the ransom for him, so he will show his so-called loyalty and courage here. And most soldiers don't want to be prisoners here. That means no salary and need to do hard labor for a long time. I will definitely be able to convince them." Joseph looked at him with interest. "What about you? Why don't you let someone redeem you?" "Well, my family is not very financially stable, and also, I admire you very much," Tine said disdainfully, "because this guy abandoned his position and fled yesterday. After returning to Brussels, only a military court will be waiting for him." A French soldier raised his gun to him and made a threatening gesture, shouting, "Shut up." Joseph narrowed his eyes slightly, raised his hand, and signaled to the soldier, "Oh, please give this general at least some decency and let him go." "Yes, Your Highness." The soldiers released their hands on Tine, but still stared at him very vigilantly. Joseph first asked someone to take Schaik to the prisoner camp, and then turned his eyes to Tine. "General Tine, perhaps we can cooperate." "Oh, how about going to my tent for a cup of tea?" Tine proudly puffed out his chest. "Oh, you don't have to waste your time. The Flemish will never be driven by anyone who speaks French." Interestingly, he said all these words in French. Of course, nowadays French is the fashion in the entire European aristocracy, and all noble aristocrats with taste will learn it. Joseph smiled and said with a hint of sarcasm, "But the Flemish people will accept being driven by people who speak German." No. Tine seemed a little embarrassed and argued, "You know, we fought." Joseph nodded. "Well, and then we chose to surrender." Tine almost shouted, "What can we do? Austria is too powerful." Joseph suddenly came in front of him and lowered his voice. "Do you really want the Flemish region to get rid of the rule of the Austrians?" Tine sneered, "And then be ruled by the French?" "Of course not," Joseph said very sincerely. "My suggestion is to establish a Flemish republic." Tine still sneered. "You mean a puppet state that accepts the protection of France?" Joseph shook his head. No, it is completely independent, with its own parliament and army, without French troops stationed, nor Austria, Prussia and other countries stationed. The Flemish Republic. Tyne was stunned for a moment and sighed. Even if we want to, we can't do it at all. What if there is French support? I mean, all-round support from military to diplomatic. Really? Tyne's eyes flashed with surprise, but he immediately suppressed all emotions, and looked at Joseph. Why do you want to help the Flemish people? Brussels. Joseph said, I want Brussels. Haha. Tyne immediately slapped his thigh and laughed. You are really a young ambitious man. Haha, Brussels? What do the Flemish people have left if they lose Brussels? The Flemish region is basically Brussels, Antwerp, Long, and the part of Ghent province north of the Scheldt River. Although Brussels only occupies about 20% of the area, it has nearly half of the economic income of the Flemish region. How could the Flemish people be willing to give it up? Joseph smiled slightly. There are still Zeeland, Breda and Hertogenbosch left. Tyne frowned and said, are you kidding? This is all Dutch territory. He suddenly realized something, and looked at Joseph in surprise. The Netherlands? You want us to take the Netherlands? Joseph nodded as a matter of course. The part south of the Waal River will become the core area of the Flemish Republic. But this is impossible now, as long as you can find a suitable political leader in the Flemish region, and convene a parliament. France will help you solve military issues. Joseph knew very well that there were more than 1.4 million Dutch-speaking people in the Flemish region. They have deep conflicts with the Walloons, and it will be difficult to rule them effectively in the future. If they are forcibly incorporated into the French territory, it will only bring endless protests and riots. It may also become a foreign tool to contain France, especially in the north. There is a Netherlands that is very close to the Flemish people, and it is even easier to incite trouble in the Flemish region. Therefore, compared with ruling here, letting them be independent is a better choice. If the Flemish occupy the three southernmost provinces of the Netherlands to establish a country, they will inevitably fight to the death with the Dutch in the future. The only thing they can rely on is the powerful country that helped them establish their country, France. The hatred of the Dutch will only be vented on the Flemish Republic, and even when there is a diplomatic need, they have to find France as a mediator. The Flemish have no ethnic and language barriers in ruling the southern provinces of the Netherlands. In addition, with the Waal River as a natural barrier, it will be extremely difficult for the Dutch to regain these places. The most important thing for France is that, if the Flemish get Zeeland, they can control the estuary of the Rhine. If France directly controls this place, it will inevitably be hostile to Britain, Prussia, Austria, and most of the German states along the Rhine. But after the establishment of the Flemish Republic, all these pressures will be borne by this small country. When necessary, France can influence the Rhine trade through Flemish without having to bear the burden of geopolitics. Tyne confirmed in disbelief. You mean, Flemish is completely independent, and France will not have any garrisons, delegated management, or diplomatic guidance? Joseph continued, as well as trade, education, news, etc. None of them will interfere. I only want Brussels. Tyne could no longer hide his excitement. In recent centuries, the Flemish people have been resisting the rule of the Spanish and Austrians. Now, they finally see the opportunity to gain freedom and independence. For this goal, even giving up Brussels is not unacceptable. After all, the southern provinces of the Netherlands are far superior to Brussels in terms of area and economy. He bowed slightly to Joseph. Your Highness, you seem to invite me to have tea just now? Yes. Joseph asked someone to lead a horse to Tyne. Please come this way. Thank you for your hospitality. Soon, the two were riding side by side. Joseph continued, so, regarding the convening of the parliament, who do you recommend? Tyne patted his chest and said proudly, in fact, I'm a member of the Antwerp Parliament, Your Highness. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 762. A new pattern in the lowlands. The two walked and talked, and soon arrived in front of the officer's tent. After entering the tent, Joseph signaled Emmanuel to bring tea and said to Tyne, "Please sit down. Regarding the nation building plan we just talked about, after you convene the members of the first parliamentary election, France will sign a formal agreement with your parliament." Tyne took the teacup excitedly and nodded repeatedly. "Thank you for your help, Your Highness the Crown Prince. I will contact the members of parliament as quickly as possible." "Very good. Then you should leave and return to Brussels as soon as possible." Joseph paused and then said, "As I said just now, my army is enough to defeat the Austrians, as well as the British and Prussian troops that may come here. However, the Flemish people must do something for their own independence, otherwise your descendants can only say when introducing their own country, when our ancestors founded the country, they did nothing." Tyne said hurriedly, "You are right, Your Highness. I will call on Flemish soldiers to resist the Austrian army as much as possible. Oh, I have to advise you that Sahake is a shameless bastard. You can't trust him." Joseph smiled and said, "Thank you for your advice. But now, one more person means one more strength. I think he is willing to do something for the establishment of the Flemish nation. As the speaker, you should be tolerant and accept any like-minded people." "Well, okay, I'll listen to you." Tyne had to nod, then hand over the soldiers you captured to him. "I will return to Brussels tonight." "Okay. You can also choose some soldiers to escort you," Joseph said. He was not afraid that Tyne would deceive him. After all, it was hard for anyone to resist the great temptation of becoming the founding father of a country. This would not only fulfill the long-cherished wish of the Flemish people for centuries, but also win great power for himself with very noble and great reasons, and at the same time, be praised by people for generations. And even if Tyne really slipped away, wouldn't there be a backup with Sahake behind him? Joseph believed that among the more than 2,600 prisoners in the barracks alone, at least 10 people willing to become the founding father of Flemish could be found. At 6 p.m., Tyne took 3 officers with more political influence and 80 soldiers to Brussels. He was not worried that the French would not keep their word, or that the French army would be defeated, because as long as he could unite the members of the Flemish district through this war, he could form a political force to bargain with Austria. Of course, if France won, he would make a lot of money, and Sahake was also very efficient. Just 3 days later, he summoned 2,000 Flemish prisoners from Austria and anyway joined the French army. Of course, Scheherazade did not have such a strong appeal, mainly because Tyne had greeted the Flemish prisoners before leaving. Not long after, the rangers sent by Joseph also returned to Wavre and reported that they had found no signs that Prince Coburg had sent troops to rescue Count Radetzky. In fact, Prince Coburg had only gathered less than 7,000 defeated troops at this time. He was still worried that the French would come to Louvain to destroy him, and desperately asked for help from the Duke of York, the British commander in Utrecht, Frederick, the second son of George III, and had no intention of taking the initiative at all. Joseph waited for another 2 days, and after the old troops such as the Artois Corps and the Rethel Corps also arrived in Wavre, he ordered an attack on the town of Mavron. The battle was without any suspense, and the newly surrendered Flemish also participated in the battle. In just 1 day, Count Radetzky surrendered. Subsequently, more than 4,000 Austrian soldiers entered the prisoner camp, most of whom were Flemish. Scheherazade immediately got busy and began to recruit the Flemish corps for Joseph. Joseph asked Lefebvre to draw some middle and lower level officers from the old French army and form 2 Flemish infantry regiments, a Flemish skirmish battalion and a Flemish cavalry battalion with the Flemish people. Well, the members of this cavalry battalion are the Austrian cavalry that was previously pitted by the Dutch cavalry. The entire Flemish corps has a total of more than 4,700 people. Although the morale and loyalty will not be too high, it is better than nothing. Anyway, the Walloon region is relatively wealthy, and there is no pressure to bear the logistics of several thousand more troops. Without taking too much rest, Joseph led nearly 30,000 troops to Brussels. As the capital of the southern Netherlands, it is the political center of Austria's rule over the southern Netherlands. As long as it is broken, the situation in the entire southern Netherlands will immediately turn upside down. At this time, Brussels is defended by only more than 20,000 weak Dutch troops, which is the best time to capture it. At the same time, the Walloon Chamber of Commerce also held a grand plenary meeting of the committee in Namur. Major General Gaillard, dressed in a neat white military uniform, straightened his collar and strode to the podium at the front of the conference hall. Yes, he has officially taken up the post of Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Wallonia Defence Force. After the demilitarized zone agreement was torn up, it became natural for the Wallonia region to form an army. Nearly 4,000 former Wallonia policemen voluntarily joined the defense force, put on the military uniforms customized from France, and immediately became soldiers on the spot. Gaillard waved his fists vigorously and said loudly, "Everyone should know that, if His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had not led the army to rescue me, I would have been killed by the Austrian army in Wavre." He did not say that he was captured, so as to arouse the committee members' common hatred of the enemy. If there is no strong France as a support, we will be ruled by the Austrians sooner or later. The blood shed by our soldiers in Wavre will become meaningless. His words immediately won the approval of more than a dozen military officers in the audience. A member of the Chamber of Commerce in his 60s stood up and said, "General Gaillard, the current high degree of autonomy in Wallonia can bring us the greatest benefits. Joining France will make us lose a lot. If I remember correctly, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince does not even accept the establishment of a parliament in Wallonia." Joseph did ask for the dissolution of the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce and did not agree to the Chamber of Commerce turning into a parliament. This kind of local parliament may be a good model in other countries, but he believes that at least in his lifetime, no local parliament can develop the local area better than himself. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, Chivenman, coughed lightly and stood up and said, "Speaking of the interests of Wallonia, in fact, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has promised me that he will invest hundreds of kilometers of wooden tracks here. Oh, the tracks will all be laid with steel." The conference hall suddenly fell silent. Most of the members present had coal mining or iron smelting industries. They knew very well how much profit they would get from laying hundreds of kilometers of railroad tracks. Chapter 763 Investment and Voting. Chivenment gave everyone enough time to digest the information, and then added, "This investment will be as high as tens of millions of francs. But if Wallonia is still outside France, the French government will most likely not approve this funding due to risk considerations." A Chamber of Commerce member in his 50s stood up uncontrollably. "Do you know how long it will take for the investment to be implemented?" Chivenment said, "Count Mirabeau's assistant came last week, and he also brought the Northwest regional manager of the French Reserve Bank. If the annexation of Wallonia to France is finalized, they will immediately sign an agreement with the newly established Namur government office. You know, the surveying and planning work has been done a long time ago, and it will be fully started around October." Everyone immediately discussed excitedly how to divide such a big cake. You know, if the government directly invests 10 million francs, it will at least drive more than 30 million in capital flows in the entire industrial chain. As long as you get a bite of it, your wealth will immediately jump up a level. And for Joseph, these investments are actually not a loss at all. Not to mention that the huge coal and iron resources in Wallonia can be more fully developed, just according to the proportion of shares held by the Industrial Development Fund in Wallonia. At least a quarter of the funds will eventually flow back to the pocket of the French government. Counting the income from rail transit in the later period, it will take about 5 or 6 years to recover the investment. Immediately, more and more Chamber of Commerce members expressed their agreement to merge with France, basically representatives of coal and iron capital, and the number soon exceeded 40. Together with the representatives, who came from the military before, it has exceeded 2/3 of the total number of members. In other words, even if Chivenman directly requested to start voting, the resolution to merge with France could be passed. But he just winked at the Chamber of Commerce's administrative advisor, Edge. The latter hurried to the stage, motioned for everyone to be quiet, took out a piece of paper, unfolded it and said, "This is the news that was sent from Paris a few days ago. The general idea is that, after being incorporated into France, Wallonia will be divided into 3 provinces, Henegor, Liege and South Brabant. The candidates for the governor and municipal commissioner will be nominated by the Chamber of Commerce." Someone immediately noticed something was wrong and asked, "Mr. Edge, are you talking about the province of South Brabant? Shouldn't it be the province of Namur?" South Brabant is a relatively large geographical name. From north to south, It includes Antwerp, Brussels, and Namur. Among them, only Namur belongs to Wallonia. Ekge adjusted his glasses, looked at the document in his hand and said, "It says here that the province of South Brabant includes Brussels and Namur." The committee members immediately exclaimed, "What? Brussels? How can it include Brussels? Have the gentlemen of the Palace of Versailles forgotten that the Flemish occupy that place?" Ekge held up a document. "His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's army has marched to Brussels 3 days ago. Perhaps, soon it will not belong to the Flemish anymore." Chauvinement continued. "The Austrian army has fled to Leuven. Right now, only some Dutch are defending Brussels." Now, the eyes of the commissioners who had previously hesitated about joining France also lit up. Brussels is the core of the southern Netherlands. If it can be integrated into the Wallonia region, it will play a huge role in promoting the overall economic development. It is no exaggeration to say that the huge market in Brussels can expand the business of everyone present by 20% to 30% in a short period of time. The next morning, the Wallonia Chamber of Commerce voted on joining France. Chapter 764, Franz II's All-In. The voting results came out in just over 10 minutes, 80 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, and no votes against. From this moment on, the Walloon region of the southern Netherlands officially became 3 provinces of France. When Chauvinement read out the results, the hall suddenly erupted in warm cheers. I don't know who took the lead and shouted, "Long live His Majesty the King." People immediately followed and began to shout, "Long live His Majesty the King. Long live France. Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Aha, we are all French." After everyone gradually quieted down, General Gaillard waved his arms again and said loudly, "Then, now we must use all our energy to ensure one thing, that is, to make France win this war." The members of the Chamber of Commerce all nodded. Gaillard continued, "I suggest that we immediately start to recruit soldiers on a large scale, and go to the Brussels front, to reinforce the French army. No, to reinforce our army. Vienna. Schönbrunn Palace." British Foreign Secretary Lord Grenville and Marquis Wellesley bowed to Francis II, signaled to the Prussian Foreign Secretary next to them, and then both left the Great Gallery. Wellesley listened to the faint curses behind him, turned his head, and said to Grenville, "Why did you deliberately refuse the Holy Roman Emperor? There is no need to expect the combat effectiveness of the Dutch army. After the defeat of Prince Coburg, there is no army on the Western Front that can resist the French. According to the situation on the battlefield, the Duke of York should send troops to reinforce the southern Netherlands as soon as possible. Otherwise the situation there will soon become unmanageable." Just 2 days ago, the news of the Austrian army's defeat in the southern Netherlands was sent back to Vienna, and a whole week had passed since the Battle of Wavre. Britain, Austria and other countries did not know that Joseph had surrounded Brussels at this time, and 30,000 troops were constantly attacking the city. Just now, Grenville refused the request of the Duke of York to reinforce Prince Coburg on the grounds that Vienna acted on its own and launched an attack on Wallonia in advance, which led to the current bad situation. According to the strategic plan previously formulated by the coalition forces, Prince Coburg should launch an attack at the same time as the coalition forces on the Rhine line, so that the French army would be under great pressure and lose sight of the big picture. However, in order to gain more say in the battle on the Rhine line, a large number of German states are located on both sides of the Rhine, and showing Austria's strong military strength here will help unify these small states in the future. So Franz II decided to resolve the war in southern Germany as soon as possible, and then transfer Prince Coburg's corps back to the Rhine area. However, the Austrian army on the Western Front was the fastest to lose, so Franz had to lower his face and ask the British army for help. Lord Grenville smiled slightly. The Austrians must learn some lessons. In addition, only if His Majesty the Emperor is anxious, he will be willing to devote all his strength to the war. Wellesley frowned, but the situation on the Western Front can't be delayed any longer. Grenville nodded. "You are right, but if I'm not mistaken, His Royal Highness the Duke of York should already be on his way to the southern Netherlands." Wellesley sighed. Originally this army should have been used to attack Luxembourg, but because of the short-sighted and underestimation of the Austrians, it had to be dragged in the southern Netherlands. Grenville smiled. Speaking of which, aren't our masters also short-sighted and underestimating the enemy? If you were allowed to command the army, you would certainly not be dawdling in Utrecht until now. Wellesley is the current British Secretary of State for War and has been leading the reform of the British Army, but he is too young and inexperienced, so the responsibility of the British Commander-in-Chief this time fell on the shoulders of the British Prince, the Duke of York. To be fair, the Duke of York's military ability is definitely in the first echelon in the UK, but in Grenville's eyes, his old friend Wellesley is the best candidate to command the British Army. Wellesley shook his head. This can't be blamed entirely on your highness. The quality of the soldiers in his hands is very poor, and it will be the same, no matter who replaces him. Grenville looked at him and said, by the way, when can your new army be put into the battlefield? The war broke out too early. Their weapons have not yet been fully equipped. Wellesley said, frowning. It's all because of the damn gas street light scam, which caused a large number of factories in London to go bankrupt. This has caused the production of new guns to become very slow. How long will it take? Now we can produce 1,300 percussion cap guns every month, and we need about 5,000. Yes, one of the most important military reforms of Wellesley was to imitate the French percussion cap gun. When he first saw this weapon, he immediately realized that the battlefield in the future would be dominated by it. So after he became the Minister of War, he immediately called the arsenal to imitate it. Thanks to the developed processing industry in Britain and a large number of skilled craftsmen, after spending 1 year and 4 months and investing nearly £100,000, they finally succeeded in imitating the percussion cap gun. Although it is slightly worse than the August 1788 model in terms of accuracy, it has at least made up for the generation gap. However, the London gas street light incident occurred afterwards. A large number of downstream factories went bankrupt, which seriously affected the manufacturing progress of the arsenal. With Wellesley's unremitting funding support, the arsenal built the entire industrial chain by itself, which brought up the production capacity. However, until this time, Wellesley's 30,000 new troops had not been fully equipped with percussion cap guns. The next day at noon, Lord Grenville came to the Great Gallery Hall again. Franz II winked at Baron Thugut with a stern face. The latter took a deep breath helplessly and said to the British, Your Majesty has decided to accept the suggestion you made yesterday. Our country will begin a general mobilization and send 50,000 to 70,000 troops to the Rhine River within half a year. His words meant that Austria's national strength would be exhausted to participate in the war. At the same time, it also meant that the emperor would cede interests to noble groups such as Hungary and Bohemia in order to win more support from them. You have made the most correct decision. Grenville saluted Franz II. Then our country will also increase the loan amount to help you maintain the army's combat. Thugut continued, Your Majesty will then summon the Holy Roman Empire states and ask them to send more troops. Previously, Franz II had declared war on France in the name of the Holy Roman Empire. In theory, all the Holy Roman Empire states had joined the war. However, most of the German states that had long been independent in fact were unwilling to get involved in this muddy water, so few actually sent troops. This time, Grenville asked the Holy Roman Emperor to force the various states to send troops, otherwise they would face joint punishment from Austria and Prussia. Chapter 765, Sea Blockade. Prussian Foreign Minister Friedrich reminded on the side about Saxony. Baron Turgot nodded sideways. Your Majesty can only accept that Prussia gets Leipzig and Wittenberg. Friedrich and Grenville looked at each other and said reluctantly, okay, we will discuss the ownership of the East Bank of Dresden later. Our country will continue to send troops to Heller as agreed. Yes, Prussia and Austria decided to divide Saxony after the war under the coordination of Britain. In this war against France, Saxony, as one of the top 4 states in Germany, refused to send troops because it was dissatisfied with Prussia's previous invasion of Poland, and even sent special envoys to France twice to explain its neutral attitude. This behavior made Prussia and Austria very angry. At the same time, the two countries have long coveted Saxony's population and handicrafts. More than a quarter of Prussia's territory was previously snatched from Saxony. Austria even briefly destroyed Saxony in the battle for the Bavarian throne. If Saxony can be eaten, it will undoubtedly make Prussia and Austria take a big bite of blood. Britain, which once did not want to see Prussia and Austria become powerful, also agreed to this shameless conspiracy under the pressure of fighting against France. After satisfying Britain and Prussia, Baron Thugut finally breathed a sigh of relief and looked at the two and said, "Then about the reinforcement of the southern Netherlands. Please rest assured that His Royal Highness the Duke of York will lead his troops south soon. The Wallace Legion will enter the southern Netherlands from Longen, and after joining Prince Coburg, they will go to Wavre together." The Dutch Strait. As dusk approached, most of the ship owners urged the sailors to dock as soon as possible, but the leisure of the Special Trade Committee raised its sails, left the port of Ostend, and headed towards the Atlantic Ocean. The ship was obviously full of cargo, which pushed the waterline very low, but under the skilled operation of the sailors, it quickly increased to a very fast speed. The sailor on the mast looked around vigilantly. Just as the sun was about to completely fall below the horizon, he suddenly shouted anxiously to the people below, "There is a British warship at 11 o'clock. Second Mate Maderno hurriedly repeated the warning to the megaphone leading to the cockpit. The entire ship immediately turned right, leaving a curved mark on the sea surface, desperately trying to avoid it. The British ship soon noticed the leisure and immediately raised the sail to chase it. Maderno stared at the warship getting closer and closer with wide eyes, and loudly ordered the sailors to throw the cargo into the sea to reduce the ship's load and increase the speed. With its familiarity with the waterway, the leisure kept a distance of more than half a nautical mile from the British warship and successfully towed it until dark. The leisure then began to make continuous sharp turns, and finally sailed into the vast Atlantic Ocean under the cover of night, barely getting rid of the pursuit of the British. In the cargo hold of the leisure, the captain looked at the cargo that was less than 1/5 left, and could not help but sigh heavily. "It seems that we can't hold on any longer." Since the war began, a large number of British warships have begun to cruise along the French coast, capturing or sinking all merchant ships leaving the port. In just 1.5 months, the Special Trade Association has lost nearly 60% of its ships. At present, only a small number of merchant ships can venture to America or the Far East under the escort of French warships, but they also have to worry about encountering the main British fleet. Chapter 766, a small tear in the blockade chain. At dawn the next day, the leisure turned to Sweden, preparing to replenish cargo there. This would definitely take some time, but it was better than going to North America empty-handed. However, just when the brig had gone less than 20 nautical miles north, the lookout once again raised his voice and sounded the alarm. 2 minutes later, Maderno finally saw a British frigate rushing from the left front of the leisure. In the past 2 months, there have been British warships roaming like hungry wolves from the English Channel to the North Sea, and if you are unlucky, you will encounter several of them. The leisure was obviously not very lucky. Moreover, this time the British warship was very cunning, using a reef to block the line of sight, and at this time it was less than 8 chains away from here. 1 nautical mile is 10 chains. In the vast Atlantic Ocean, the two ships were almost face to face. The leisure desperately turned to the left, but the sailboat needed to draw a large arc to turn around. When it and the British warship were heading in the same direction, Maderno could already see the color of the British uniforms in the distance with his naked eyes. The British sailors' ship handling skills were obviously superior. Only 20 minutes later, the frigate appeared more than 200 yards behind the side of the leisure and sent out the flag signal "Stop immediately and accept search." The leisure would naturally not stop obediently. A month ago, Britain announced a comprehensive trade embargo against France, and the British Navy could capture and seize any French merchant ship. Stopping the ship at this time meant being arrested by the British, and there would only be two results: imprisonment or hard labor. After a few minutes of stalemate, the British warship opened fire. With a deafening roar, 7 or 8 huge splashes of water splashed around the leisure, shocking everyone on the ship to shout, "Run," and speed up in fear. The British gunners were very skilled. After 2 rounds of calibration, 2 18-pound shells accurately hit the leisure, tearing a hole in its stern cabin and gun deck. Maderno could hear the triumphant shouts of British officers in the distance, probably urging them to reload. He closed his eyes in despair. If this continued, the leisure would be sunk in no time. "Mr. Maderno." The boatswain suddenly ran over in a hurry and shouted to him. Please give an order. What should we do now? Me. Give an order? Yes, yes. The captain is dead, and Mr. Juno is also seriously injured. You are now acting captain. Juno was the first mate on the ship. Moderno suddenly felt dizzy. He just came to follow the smuggling ship to make a living. How could he command the leisure to deal with the British warships? The British cannon sounded again, and the hull of the leisure shook violently again. It was unknown where it was hit. Moderno hesitated for only a second, then said to the boatswain with a pale face, raise the white flag, lower the sail, surrender. Oh, okay. The boatswain was about to turn around when he heard the lookout shout, there's a ship coming at 4 o'clock. Moderno subconsciously raised his telescope to look, but he couldn't help but be stunned. It was a strange looking 3-masted sailing ship, flying the French blue iris flag, and it was heading straight towards this side. On the suddenly appearing 3-masted sailing ship, Baron Falcade looked at the British frigate in the distance and shook his head nervously. Mr. Barr, the Cloud is carrying an important mission. You shouldn't take such a risk. Captain Michel Barr smiled. Don't worry, I'm sure I can get out of danger at any time. Don't you think we are like a knight challenging a dragon now? Oh, my grandfather is a knight. He was in the 30 Years' War. The voice of the lookout came from the megaphone, 700 yards away from the enemy. Captain Barr made an apologetic expression to Baron Falcade, turned his head, and ordered the first mate, turn 1 compass point to the west, pass by the side of that guy, and be careful to keep a distance. He shouted into the megaphone again, pressure the boiler, and prepare to start the propellers. Baron Falcade looked out the porthole and saw that the gun port cover on the starboard side of the British warship had been opened. He swallowed hard and whispered, God bless you. A few minutes later, the mist passed 450 yards to the right of the frigate, and the 3 cannons on the port side spewed flames at the British. Of course, at such a long distance, it was impossible for the mist to hurt the enemy ship with its 18-pound guns, but this was like someone spitting at a beast. Not much damage, but full of insult. Sure enough, the British warship seemed to hesitate for a moment, then turned right and rushed straight towards the mist. Moderno looked at the strange ship, which was slightly larger than the leisure, and led the British away. He was so moved that he almost cried. He immediately turned the rudder hard and fled in the opposite direction. When the leisure had distanced itself from the British warship, he looked back again, but saw billowing black smoke coming out of the brave strange ship. He raised the telescope in confusion, and then he noticed that the rear of the strange ship was equipped with 2 wooden wheels like water wheels, which had begun to rotate and slap the water surface. What is that? The newly promoted second mate Denville also saw this scene. Is it on fire? Moderno shook his head. It's a steamship. I heard about it in Ostend. There are many such ships for transportation on the Rhine River, and they are very fast. Denville nodded with his eyes wide open. When the 2 ships were about to disappear under the sea level, he had seen that the distance between the steamship and the frigate behind it had increased a lot. The Cloud was not the kind of steam paddle steamer in the Rhine. For ocean voyages, that kind of small boat would definitely not work. This was a special merchant ship that was rushed to be built by the Brest shipyard 2 months before the war, in accordance with the requirements of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. The power system follows the same system as the paddle steamers for inland shipping, but it has been replaced with an improved version of the LJ26H steam engine, which can provide 29 horsepower. This steam engine seems a bit weak for an ocean-going ship, and can only help the ship increase its speed by less than 1 knot. But for getting rid of the entanglement of British warships, 1 knot is enough. To be honest, paddle steamers are not suitable for sailing on the sea. Wind and waves can easily destroy the fragile paddle wheels, and there is no place to replenish coal. But Joseph doesn't care about these. As long as they can break through the blockade of the offshore area, once they enter the vast Atlantic Ocean, the possibility of being discovered by the British becomes negligible. In the era without radar, it is more difficult to find a ship on the open sea than to accurately pick out a grain of wheat in a wheat field. The British cannot blockade America together, so it doesn't matter if the paddle wheel is damaged, just sail in the Atlantic Ocean with sails. This kind of makeshift special merchant ship is currently the only means to break through the British maritime blockade. It's just that, because the Brest shipyard uses most of its production capacity on the construction of steam warships, there are only 7 such special merchant ships at present. But it can transport some sugar and cotton back from America, which is of strategic significance to France's trade. After all, if France gets 1 more pound of sugar, Britain will get 1 less pound. You know, since the war, due to the panic of sugar supply in the British market, the largest sugar producer in Europe is in France, which provides nearly half of Britain's sugar. This has caused the price of sugar in Britain to rise by 4.2 times compared to before the Caribbean independence movement. Chapter 767. Saving France is saving America. That's right, even after the war, Britain had to keep buying sugar from France. At the same time, France also continued to supply sugar products to the whole of Europe. After all, the British had to get sugar to live, and France invested heavily in the sugar beet industry. There were many farmers who relied on growing sugar beets for their livelihood, and the refined sugar also needed to be sold. Besides, the price of sugar is so high now, only a fool would not sell it. In fact, the high profits from sugar currently support almost 1/5 of France's military expenditure. What is somewhat different from people's usual concept is that no matter how fierce the war is, most of the economic exchanges between the people are still continuing. Just like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, they wanted to dig each other's ancestral graves, but in fact, the business that should be done has always been done, but the transaction method may be a little fancy. Of course, France relies on the transportation volume of only 7 merchant ships, which is far from meeting the trade needs of the Americas and the Far East. It can still persist in the short term, but if the war drags on too long, the impact on the domestic economy will still be very large. The first is the shortage of industrial raw materials. France's cotton, wool, leather, oil, and even ropes are heavily dependent on foreign imports. After these things are industrially processed in France, they are sold all over the world with high added value. If there is a shortage of raw materials, France's industry will soon shrink on a large scale. The second is a reduction in the market. After the products are made, if the funds cannot be recovered, it will further undermine France's industrial foundation. The decline of industry and commerce is followed by a national economic crisis. Therefore, the overall situation of France facing the British naval blockade is still very dangerous. It must win on the battlefield as soon as possible to break the deadlock. Another thing is to use diplomatic means as much as possible to gain a favorable situation for France. More than 50 days later, the Cloud finally completed the crossing of the Atlantic and arrived at the port of Philadelphia in the United States. Baron Fourcade changed into a very formal outfit and met the US Secretary of State Jefferson, who came to greet him at the port. Fourcade came to the United States as a special envoy of the King of France. He originally planned to follow the French Navy's fleet to North America, but Lord Richard Howe had been leading the English Channel Fleet to wander around the port of Le Havre to the port of Brest, and a large number of warships leaving the port could easily attract the attention of the British Navy. If a diplomat like him was captured by the British, it would be very troublesome. So, under the advice of the French Navy, he took a different approach and quietly came to the United States on the Trade Express ship. After a simple welcome ceremony, Fourcade submitted a note to Jefferson. The content was very simple, which was to ask the United States to comply with the French-American Alliance Treaty and immediately declare war on Britain. Joseph knew very well that the United States, a traitor, had betrayed France in history. After France and the anti-French alliance went to war, it was difficult for the United States to trade with France due to the British naval blockade. In order to make up for the missing market, the Americans immediately signed the Jay Treaty with Britain and turned to Britain, without mentioning the fact that Louis XVI almost bankrupted the country in order to support American independence. After that, he even defaulted on the huge loan provided by France when the United States became independent. In this life, Joseph naturally could not let the United States be indecisive and stab France at will. Washington immediately used delaying tactics, always using the excuse that the Parliament needed to discuss and vote, and made Fourcade wait for more than half a month. And Fourcade was not in a hurry to urge Washington. Instead, he began to give speeches in various places in Philadelphia according to the instructions of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. The theme was to recall how France helped the United States gain independence, the deep brotherhood between the United States and France, and the shameless Britain provoked the war again. The brothers of the United States and France should unite as before, and teach the British a lesson together. At the same time, the French-controlled American news also followed suit, talking about the British naval blockade, which was actually a conspiracy to destroy the United States' trade with Europe and weaken the United States. If France was defeated, Britain would immediately concentrate its forces to turn the North American continent into its own colony again. For a time, a saying became popular all over the United States: saving France is saving the United States. Afterwards, some people began to gather people to march in front of the US Congress, shouting to abide by the treaty and oppose British hegemony. Chapter 768. Give him a trick. The United States would not tolerate these troublemakers. Attorney General Jennings Randolph immediately mobilized the militia to disperse the marchers. The marchers did not put up much resistance. "Let me go, I will go," but they circled the street and ran to the door of the federal court to continue shouting slogans. Well, 1/3 of these people are paid to do their jobs, so they seem very professional. They planned the action plan a week in advance, including how to expand their influence and what to do after encountering the militia. So even though Randolph mobilized thousands of militiamen and strictly guarded all important departments in Philadelphia, he still could not extinguish the passion of the marchers. The salaries of these professionals are all from an organization called the Association for the Relief of the Independence War Disabled. The purpose of the association is to enable American citizens who have been harmed by British colonists to survive. Of course, the staff of the association hate the British invaders who once harmed American citizens, which is very reasonable. So, after hearing that the British had started a war against their dear French friends, the association angrily organized this large-scale march. The funds of the association mainly come from plantation owners in Georgia and South Carolina, most of whom are French. After being destroyed by Booker's slave army, French merchants, on the advice of the Minister of Trade, bought a large number of cotton plantations in these two places. At the beginning of this year, in order to give back to the United States, they funded the establishment of the Association for the Relief of the Independence War Disabled under the call of a little-known lawyer and orator John Castle. No one knows that Mr. Castle has another identity, that is, a captain agent of the French intelligence agency. The erudite Mr. Castle called the association a non-governmental organization, which means an organization that conducts public welfare activities without relying on the power of the government. However, this definition is quite difficult to pronounce, so everyone usually just refers to it as NGO. As for how to form and operate an NGO, the later American CIA has done a lot of demonstrations. Joseph just copied a manual to Fauci, who quickly understood it and began to implement it. However, this skill can only be used in a parliamentary country like the United States. If a monarchy like Russia or Austria dares to do this, the secret police will come to arrest people in a minute. When people who oppose British hegemony began to sit in the Northwest Square of Philadelphia, holding up a picture of a little girl who was brutally killed by the British during the War of Independence, and the number of participants increased, the federal Congress finally felt a headache. In Franklin's villa, several bigwigs of the United States looked at the hundreds of petitioning citizens walking on the street not far away, all with frowns. I went to the square yesterday afternoon and saw thousands of people gathered there. House Speaker Madison shook his head. These stupid guys have no idea what it means to be involved in the war between Britain and France. Ordinary people just want to vent their emotions. They don't care about so many things. Hamilton's voice was filled with anger. It's all the fault of the French envoy. He has been giving speeches everywhere during this period, which has made these idiots lose their heads. Jefferson, who is more pro-French, shrugged. Frankly speaking, he is just stating the facts, whether it is the treaty or the ongoing war in Europe. But it is impossible for us to lose so much benefit for France. Chief Justice Jay's negotiations are what we expect. As Hamilton was speaking, his assistant suddenly pushed the door open and rushed in, waving a newspaper anxiously and said, "Mr. Hamilton, something bad has happened." Hamilton looked at him unhappily. "Don't be so rash, Clark. What's wrong?" You'd better read it yourself." Hamilton took a copy of the Philadelphia Reporter from his assistant, unfolded it, and saw the headline on the front page: "The government is negotiating with Britain and plans to improve diplomatic relations between the United States and Britain in exchange for benefits." He hurriedly looked down, and the text elaborated in detail that, in order to expand trade with Britain, the US government was prepared to no longer pursue the British Navy's seizure of American merchant ships, and not to return American citizens who were captured by the British as sailors. At the same time, the United States will open the Mississippi River to British merchant ships, and prohibit the looting of ships flying the British flag along the coast of the United States. Yes, after Britain began to blockade France's maritime trade, dozens of American merchant ships going to France for trade were seized by the British Navy. This incident caused a lot of noise in the United States, and this news actually said that the US government decided to let it go. It can be imagined that after this news spread, the United States will immediately explode. However, what made Hamilton sweat the most was that the US government was indeed prepared to do so, and the negotiator Jay was already on the ship to London. He stuffed the newspaper to Jefferson and Rawd, who leaked the news. There were less than 10 senior US officials who knew about this secret negotiation, and it was impossible for them to leak it out. The people in the room looked at each other and shook their heads. Of course, they didn't know that the content of the negotiation was guessed by Joseph. At present, the international situation facing the United States is not much different from that in history, and the people in power are still these people, so the policies they formulate will definitely follow the old path. So Joseph asked Baron Fourcade to announce the US government's negotiation conditions in advance, strip off their underpants, and use American public opinion to force Washington to abandon these policies. Hamilton glanced at the clock, grabbed his coat, and ran out the door, saying to Jefferson, "The French envoy is coming soon. You perfunctorily deal with him. I will report to Mr. President." In this way, the US-France Diplomatic Coordination Conference, originally scheduled to start here at noon, was postponed to 2 days later. That afternoon, Washington personally refuted the rumor in front of the Congress Hall, saying that the US government would never give in to Britain, that merchant ships illegally seized by Britain must be compensated, and that all captured American citizens would return home. The Mississippi River will always be the private property of American merchant ships, and will never be allowed to be touched by the British, and the US government has never intended to abandon its French allies. Thanks to his quick response, the American Shipping Association was able to prevent ship owners from making trouble in Philadelphia. While Washington was speaking publicly, a fast-sailing ship also left the port of Philadelphia, ready to bring back Chief Justice Jay, the negotiating representative with Britain. However, at the coordination meeting 2 days later, the French envoy brought good news to the American bosses, who were busy putting out fires everywhere. France would agree that the United States would remain neutral and not participate in the war. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 769, America's Little Abacus. In fact, Joseph never expected the United States to really abide by the Alliance Treaty and declare war on Britain. Not to mention the economic dependence of the United States on Britain, the United States would have to explode within 3 months of the war. Just based on the combat power of the United States, if it really wanted to act as an ally of France, it would probably have to send troops to rescue it. Therefore, as long as the United States, an important source of raw materials, and a not so large sales market, could be stabilized, it would be completely acceptable to France. Jefferson excitedly bowed to Baron Fourcade and said, "Thank you, His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, for your broad mind and understanding of the difficult situation of the United States. Please rest assured that our country will strictly abide by the principle of neutrality." Fourcade immediately smiled and said, "His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, always hopes that the United States will always be prosperous and strong, so you must not relax in terms of trade income." Trade income? Jefferson was stunned. "What do you mean?" "Sugar. You should know how high the current sugar price is," said Fourcade. His Highness hopes that all sugar products result from the United States can keep a close eye on the market price and not miss out on the profits that should be made. Jefferson immediately understood that this was a request that the United States should not use low-priced sugar to help Britain overcome the sugar shortage. The so-called market price of sugar, isn't that the price of the Paris Agricultural Futures Exchange? He forced a stiff smile. You see, with our country's small amount of sugar production, it is not enough to affect the British market. Forcade didn't beat around the bush with him and waved his hand and said, the sugar your country purchases from the Caribbean can do this. Joseph knew very well that with French merchant ships unable to reach the Caribbean, American smuggling ships were the only sales channel for all plantations in the Caribbean. If you really force them not to sell to Americans, they would most likely have to sell directly to the British. Jefferson grinned awkwardly and said with a stiff upper lip, but the trade demand between our country and Britain seriously restricts the price of sugar. Forcade knew that the United States wanted to use low-priced sugar in exchange for more tickets to enter the British market. He shouted, excuse me, but the United States needs to be tougher. Jefferson had a bitter look on his face. That clearly meant I can't do it. With the small size of the United States, how could it dare to be tough with Britain? What's more, Britain had given its Caribbean colonies to the United States in exchange for low-priced sugar. The United States dared not breach the contract. Seeing this, Forcade leaned towards him and whispered, hodling and selling at a high price. Ah. Before Jefferson could react, US Treasury Secretary Hamilton's eyes lit up. You are truly a master in the field of trade. It's a simple truth. Britain has no idea how much sugar the United States smuggles in from the Caribbean. Once the price of sugar is low, the United States will tighten its belt and tell Britain that the sugar is sold out, and the price of sugar will naturally rise. And there is no need to reduce sales too much. 20% less goods on the market can lead to a 40% price increase. As long as the British feel that North American sugar is slightly cheaper than French sugar, it will be fine. This will not only meet the requirements of the French, but also not delay their own money making. Why not? As for the secret agreement with the British, just kidding. The United States and Britain are enemies. Look at the painting of the little girl who was killed by the British in the Northwest Square. Every American citizen with a conscience will agree with the government's decision. What Hamilton didn't know was that his decision at this time would push the price of sugar in London from 4 times higher than last year to 6 times higher. Jefferson had a brief exchange with the Secretary of the Treasury and expressed to the French envoy that he agreed in principle to the price limit for sugar products sold to Britain. Well, it is a minimum price limit. Baron Forcade continued. In addition to the price of sugar, His Royal Highness also asked the United States to promise to sell cotton, timber, oil and other products according to France's needs, and the price must not be higher than that sold to Britain. Jefferson looked puzzled. Our country wants to maintain exports to France very much, but you know that the British fleet has blockaded the coast. Forcade smiled and said, American merchant ships only need to unload the goods in Genoa. Genoa is a neutral port in southwestern Italy, very close to Toulon, France, and can be reached by land in a few days. Hamilton frowned. Mr. Envoy, if I remember correctly, Sardinia has chosen to stand on the side of Austria. France and Genoa are separated by the Sardinian province of Nizza. Forcade nodded. Don't worry about this. We will pay in Genoa and then find a way to ship it back to France. In fact, he was also somewhat curious about how His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was going to transport such a large amount of goods from under Sardinia's nose without anyone noticing. Of course, he didn't know that Joseph had no intention of transporting it secretly, but had confidence in Napoleon. Sardinia would soon be a French-occupied zone, so wouldn't the convoy be able to move freely? As for the future, when the French Navy gained control of the Mediterranean, American merchant ships would be able to dock directly in Marseille. By then, if the British Navy dared to completely block the Strait of Gibraltar and prevent any merchant ships from entering the Mediterranean, Joseph would be looking forward to it, because that would be tantamount to cutting off trade between the United States, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands and a large number of other countries and the Mediterranean coastal countries. I wonder if Britain can appease them all. The Americans had no objection to unloading the goods in Genoa, as long as they paid. It would only be a matter of walking a few hundred more nautical miles. A week later, Baron Fourcade and Jefferson, on behalf of both countries, secretly signed a package agreement on diplomacy and trade. At the port of Philadelphia, Fourcade waved goodbye to the Americans on the shore. The Cloud raised its sails and slowly sailed towards the sea. The assistant standing beside him sighed and said, "In the end, the Americans still escaped their obligations to the Allies, when we needed the Allies the most." Fourcade smiled and turned to walk towards the cabin. "I think that since His Royal Highness the Crown Prince authorized us to do this, he must have made some arrangements." He did not expect that his words would really come true. At this time in the western suburbs of Philadelphia, another NGO United States Veterans Home was busy. This is a public welfare organization dedicated to helping veterans who participated in the American War of Independence, but did not receive resettlement fees to maintain their lives. The funds are mainly provided by the American News newspaper and a mysterious rich man. In the end, Mr. Brunet turned around to block the British cavalry to save us. An American veteran in his 40s said, wiping away the tears in his eyes. "I never saw him again afterwards. May he rest in peace in heaven." The more than 30 veteran representatives around him also looked sad. In the past few hours, they had been recalling the past when American and French soldiers joined forces to fight the British. The veteran who was speaking clenched his fists. "We should find a way to repay our French friends." A staff member of the Veterans Home continued, "France also needs your help." Chapter 770, Encounter in the Mediterranean. The American veteran immediately took out a few coins from his pocket and put them on the table without hesitation. "Here are $5. I hope it can help our French friends. I will donate another $3 every month in the future." This donation seems pitiful, but you have to know that after retiring, he made a living by helping others drive horse carriages, and his income was only $8 and 45 fijos a month. With the $2 of relief issued by the Veterans Home, he could barely support his family. In other words, he had to donate nearly 30% of his property to France. Figio is a small denomination copper coin in the United States, which was later replaced by cents. After he set an example, other American veterans followed suit and soon a small pile of coins appeared on the table. At this moment, a short nobleman with a square face and a white wig on his big head pushed the door open and said loudly in accented English, "No, France cannot take this money, even if it is in trouble. It will make your children starve." Everyone turned their heads. When two veterans saw his appearance, they were obviously stunned for a moment and then shouted excitedly and pleasantly, "General Noailles, it's really you." The man who came was the brother-in-law of Marquis Lafayette, Viscount Louis Marc de Noailles. He had served as an adjutant under Lafayette and participated in many battles in the American Revolutionary War, including the Battle of Yorktown. He was quite prestigious in the American Army. He was also a major sponsor of the Veterans Home and was responsible for managing the daily operations here. When the veterans in the room heard that Viscount Noailles had come in person, they quickly stood up and saluted him. Noailles nodded to the veterans and ordered the staff of the Veterans Home to return the money to them. The American veterans immediately became anxious. An old soldier with a stubble on his face and 2 missing fingers said angrily, "General, I once attacked the Yorktown fortress with your legion. If I could afford the travel expenses to Europe, I would definitely go to France to teach the British bastards a lesson." His words were echoed by a group of people. "That's right. I often clean my flintlock rifle, and I can definitely blow the British's head off. I also want to let the British know how powerful I am. Hey, the cheapest ticket to cross the Atlantic is $25. Viscount Noailles nodded, looked at everyone and said, "Do you really want to go to France?" The old soldiers looked at each other, and a few of them seemed eager to try, but then they sat down again. It's okay to be excited, but if they really go to Europe, their wives and children will starve to death. Viscount Noailles smiled and said, "In fact, a few of my friends have raised a sum of money and plan to organize volunteers to fight in France. You all have rich combat experience. If you join, my friends will definitely be willing to pay some of your living expenses." An old soldier blurted out, "If I have $9, I will go." He was immediately despised by other veterans. However, Noailles shook his head and said, $15 a month. If you provide your own uniform and weapons, you can also get a $15 allowance. The veteran who wanted $9 said in disbelief, "Are you serious?" "Of course, I swear in the name of God." The salary can also be paid to your family by the veteran's home. If you are disabled, a pension will be issued according to the standards of the US Army. "I believe you." The veteran immediately shouted excitedly, "I'll sign up." His current income is only $9 a month. Going to France to fight can increase his income by 66%, and there will be a pension. This is not going to help France fight. It is completely an opportunity for France to make money for him. I'm going to. And me. My uniform and gun are still there. I even kept the flag of the Legion. I'll help old Mike and Donald sign up. They will definitely thank me. The other veterans immediately followed suit. Most of them lived in poverty after retiring, and $15 a month was a huge attraction. Soon, more than 90 people signed up. Only 37 people participated in this conference, and the others signed up on behalf of others. A week later, Noels looked at the American volunteer registration form with satisfaction, which had as many as 480 people in his hand, put it aside, and began to write a report to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. "You know, these are only the veterans in Philadelphia." According to his estimate, after the news spreads, the United States will have at least 3,000 veterans going to France to fight. Joseph invested so much money in American mercenaries, but he didn't expect them to have much combat effectiveness. But as long as these veterans wearing the uniforms of the American Continental Army began to fight the British Army, it would be equivalent to completely cutting off the possibility of the US government and the British making peace. Moreover, as the news of the continuous death of American soldiers spread back to the country, supplemented by propaganda offensives, the hatred between the United States and Britain will inevitably continue to deepen. By then, the Second Anglo-American War might have broken out ahead of time. I wonder if the Canadian Corps can set a fire this time and help rename the US presidential palace to the White House. More than 10 days later, the first batch of 500 American volunteers boarded more than 10 merchant ships and set off for Genoa, Western Mediterranean. Barbarisi. Moderno stood on the deck of the Overlook and gently stroked the chimney fence, as if it was the hair of his most beloved girl. No, even Angela back then had never fascinated him so much. This frigate of the French Mediterranean Fleet is simply full of magic. It can speed at 12 knots in the Mediterranean and can make exaggerated sharp turns like a barracuda. Even if it loses its mainmast, it can still maintain a speed of 6 knots, while other ships encountering the same situation can only spin in place. At the same time, it is equipped with only 170 crew members, none of whom are oarsmen. Yes, after Moderno fled back to the port of Ostend in the leisure, he decided not to go out to sea anymore. There were British warships everywhere, and he could not make a living from maritime trade. Then the Special Trade Association suggested that he join the French Navy. He was completely confused at the time. A smuggling organization actually asked him to join the Navy. However, soon a naval officer came to chat with him, and after learning that he had served as a captain, he promised to grant him the rank of second lieutenant. At first he was a little uneasy, but when he came to the Overlook, he soon felt relieved. Even if this magical warship could not defeat the British fleet, it would be difficult to be sunk in the Mediterranean Sea. As long as it wanted to run, it was almost impossible for British warships to catch up with it. Just as Moderno was reminiscing about the past, bursts of whistles suddenly came from all around. This meant that the enemy was discovered. The Overlook was about to go into battle. He hurried into the cabin and shouted to the sailors to take their positions. He was the chief boatswain, and this was his duty. Chapter 771 Hunting. Immediately, a herald ran back and forth on the ship, loudly conveying the captain's instructions. The British fleet was spotted at 2 o'clock, 2 nautical miles away. There are 5 merchant ships, 2 cruisers and 2 frigates. Madno's heart was suddenly hanging. A cruiser is a 5th level battleship, usually equipped with 44 cannons. On his side, there are only 3 frigates, Overlook, Seagull Wing and Great Tide. They are all equipped with only 21 guns. If a battle occurs, there is no possibility of winning. Logically speaking, the captain should immediately order to avoid it. But the current course of his fleet is clearly heading towards the British fleet. He sighed in his heart. God, I just escaped from the English Channel. Please bless me not to die in the Mediterranean. Half a minute later, the rapid sound of drums rang through the overlook. This is a battle alarm. Apparently, the enemy ship also discovered the French warship and began to slowly turn westward, aiming the port side at the overlook. At this time, the sea was blowing from the west, which was a typical tactic to seize the upper wind. At the same time, the merchant ships fled straight to the south, forming a situation where the British warships were between themselves and the French formation. Pressure the boiler. The captain's voice came from the communication tube, and then the non-commissioned officer in the engine room shouted the same thing. Pressure the boiler. Add coal quickly. Billowing black smoke came out of the chimneys of the 3 French steam frigates one after another. The speed of the ship suddenly increased a lot, as if this was the Atlantic Ocean with strong sea breezes, not the calm Mediterranean. The British warships were obviously also very surprised, and hurriedly accelerated the speed of adjusting the formation. The 2 galley frigates moved to the easternmost side, intending to cover the merchant ships. The Seagull wing played a series of flag signals. It was the flagship of the formation, and was going to command the other 2 ships to fight. The 3 steam warships immediately began to deflect, and at the same time, a huge click sound came from the boilers, which was obviously at full capacity. Their sterns dragged out narrow white traces, and at an incredible speed, they circled to the easternmost side of the British fleet. The British warships immediately followed and moved southeast, always forming a straight line with their heads connected to their tails, aiming their broadside main guns at the French frigates. Although the commander of the British fleet was a little surprised at the speed of the enemy ships, he was calm in his heart. He knew the combat effectiveness of the small frigates on the opposite side. As long as the opponent entered the range of his cannons, the battle would end within more than 10 minutes. Usually speaking, a 44-gun cruiser was enough to sink 2 frigates, and even if facing 3, it would not be at a disadvantage. He had 2 cruisers on his side, and 2 frigates to assist. However, what he didn't understand was that the French were like crazy, rushing over to ask for a fight. He even began to wonder if there was a large French fleet ambushing nearby. But he immediately laughed at himself. The main force of the French Mediterranean fleet was blocked by Lord Samuel Hood in Toulon Harbour. Where could there be any ambush? The second mate turned to him and said, "Major Hicks, the enemy ship is still 800 yards away from us. According to British naval regulations, a distance of 350 yards is considered the best firing range. With the current high speed of the French ship, even if it starts to turn immediately, it will plunge into the range of its own battle line." He raised his hand calmly. "Prepare to fire." "Yes, Commander." The gun port covers of the British ship were all opened. One after another, black cannons poked out from inside. Major Hicks had already raised his hand to cover his ears. The first round of artillery fire is usually very harsh, and it will be much better after the ears are numb. However, his eyes suddenly widened when he looked out of the porthole. He saw that the French ship, which was only more than 600 yards away from him, suddenly turned sharply to the right, and with completely incredible turning efficiency, it threw its own battle line to the port side. The 3 ships emitting black smoke were seriously tilted because they turned too quickly, and the angle with the sea level was almost 60 degrees. At this time, the French bow was facing southwest, which was already half against the wind, but their speed was still maintained at a very high state. With rich experience in naval battles, Hicks immediately estimated that according to the current situation, the French frigate would pass by the end of his battle line in a few minutes. Once they go around, they will be able to face those merchant ships directly. His eyes twitched, and he hurriedly ordered, "Turn left, quickly. Turn left 1.5 compass points. Don't worry about the formation. Fire. Fire now." At this time, the 2 sides were about 550 yards apart. Although it was within the maximum range of the cannon, the hit effect would definitely not be good. "Yes, Commander." Major Hicks stared at the French ship that was constantly sailing to his left rear, and silently said in his heart, "God, please hit a few shots." The hull of the British cruiser made a creaking sound. It was turning desperately, but its speed was still much slower than the French ship. The 2 paddle boats had already turned around, and the 18-pound guns on the port side began to emit a series of roars, and the surrounding sea surface was suddenly covered with white smoke. Large waves rose around the French warship, but the distance was so far, and it was a target sailing at high speed. If you want to hit it directly, you can only rely on God's miracle. The French ship did not fight back, but just hurried on its way. When the British cruiser aimed its side at them, the overlook at the rear just passed by the westernmost side of the British formation, and through the stern to the British. The 32-pound heavy guns of the British cruiser roared, but the shells just fell powerlessly into the sea a few dozen yards away from the French ship. Hicks hurriedly raised his telescope and looked south. His merchant ship had sailed a little more than 1 nautical mile. With the exaggerated speed of those French ships, they would catch up with them in 10 minutes at most. He turned and yelled to the second mate, "Let the beacon and the dragonfly catch up. We must entangle the French." The 2 British galleys immediately turned around, and the rowers in the bottom warehouse rowed with all their strength under the encouragement of the supervisor's whip. Finally, after a few minutes of acceleration, they barely reached the speed of the French ship. Modeno held the mast tightly, staring at the British merchant ship getting closer and closer in front of him, and then turned his head to look at the British warships in the distance. Suddenly, he felt like a seabird flying freely. The fish was just in front, waiting for him to catch it, and all the wind and waves were left far behind. Free, relaxed, and enjoy the present. The British merchant ships also found that something was wrong, and began to disperse and flee in different directions in order not to be wiped out. 7 or 8 minutes later, the Overlook caught up with the merchant ship with the words Longtail Ray painted on its bow, and soon sailed alongside it. Modeno heard the crunch sound of the cannon wheels rolling under his feet. The next moment, fierce flames flashed from the gun cabins from the bow to the stern. The merchant ship 200 yards away suddenly trembled, and large pieces of wood chips burst out from the middle of the hull and the poop, flying all over the sky. Chapter 772 Ranger Tactics. The British merchant ship had never expected that it would be attacked by a French frigate, even though it was escorted by a Royal Navy cruiser. The ship was in chaos. The second mate commanded the sailors to throw the cargo into the sea in an attempt to reduce the weight and increase the speed of the ship to escape. The gunner whipped the gunners who were huddled in the cabin and ordered them to fight back. In this era of pirates, merchant ships are equipped with cannons. Of course, merchant ships are far inferior to professional warships in terms of cannon power, quantity, and protection. The gunner of this merchant ship was very lucky. An 18-pound cannon shell hit the ribs of the Overlook in the first firing. However, the short-barreled guns on the merchant ship only left a dent on the side of the Overlook, which then attracted a more fierce attack. After more than 10 rounds of salvos, the French frigate had already blasted the merchant ship to pieces, but the British galleys behind it also caught up. In the era of sailing warships, it was very difficult to sink an opponent with solid shells. Usually, it took dozens of salvos to do it, or luck to make a hole in the target below the waterline. The Overlook was preparing to adjust the angle of the ship to fight, but accidentally destroyed the rudder of the merchant ship in the last salvo. The captain immediately changed his strategy and ordered to abandon the target that had lost its ability to move and chase another merchant ship that had just disappeared on the sea level. On the sea surface 1 nautical mile away, the British merchant ship named Box Jellyfish caught fire under the fierce bombardment of the great tide. The sailors on the ship jumped into the sea one after another under the licking of the flames, and the screams could be heard even by Modeno. Half an hour later, the Overlook made a big circle on the sea, but failed to find the British merchant ship that fled to the southeast. It seems that the captain of the ship has very rich experience in escaping at sea. When Modeno heard the order to give up the pursuit, he shook his head regretfully, but soon felt relieved. The merchant ship could run so fast, it must have thrown all the cargo into the sea, which was enough to make the British feel distressed for a while. He looked at the British galley that had been following them relentlessly and smiled disdainfully. In an hour at most, the ship would be left behind because of the decline in the rowers' physical strength. Then, the Overlook turned southwest and rushed to the agreed coordinates to meet up with the other 2 ships in the formation. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the 3 French warships reunited and exchanged flag signals with each other to exchange the results they had just obtained. The Seagull Wing and the Great Tide both sank their targets, but the Overlook was greedy for a double kill and failed to sink any of them. Not long after, the flagship Seagull Wing sent a flag signal, ordering everyone to turn back and completely destroy the merchant ship that had lost its ability to move. However, just as they sailed 7 or 8 nautical miles north, the battle alarm sounded again on the ship. Maderno looked up at the lookout. The latter pointed to the sea in the distance and shouted, "There is a British cruiser 1.5 nautical miles ahead." What they didn't know was that the British commander Hicks was furious because 3 merchant ships were destroyed under his nose. He ordered his warships to search for French frigates in the nearby waters, hoping to sink 1 or 2 to save face. At this time, the British cruiser also discovered the French warship and immediately rushed over with murderous intent. After the French frigate formation confirmed that there was only this cruiser nearby, the flagship Seagull Wing decisively issued an order to attack. Maderno's heart was hanging again. It was easy to use speed to abuse merchant ships, but with the small size of the frigates on his side, wanting to challenge the 44-gun cruiser was like 3 hounds fighting a brown bear. However, he remembered the ranger tactics he had trained before, and the tension in his heart dissipated slightly. He turned around and shouted to the sailors around him, "What are you still standing there for? Return to your post immediately." The British cruiser approached the Seagull Wing fearlessly. As long as it was within range, the fierce firepower on the ship could severely damage the frigate in a few minutes. However, the flagship of the French fleet turned around flexibly and pointed the 3 32-pound guns at the stern of the British cruiser. At the same time, the Overlook and Great Tide each drew an arc and sailed towards the stern of the British battleship. 10 minutes later, the stern gun of the Seagull Wing opened fire first. The long guns that the French loved the most finally played out their theoretical range advantage at this time. The British cruiser relied on its thick hull and gritted its teeth to chase behind, but its bow gun was extremely weak. The mainstream tactics of this era was to fire heavy guns from the side, and who would install heavy guns on the bow and stern of the ship, so it could only be hit and could not fight back. When the British warships chased for 4 nautical miles, they finally realized that the French frigate in front was slowing down and teasing it. Although the 3 32-pound guns at the stern only hit it twice, they still smashed 2 eye-catching holes in its bow. Then, 2 other French frigates rushed over from the side and rear. Hicks hurriedly ordered a turn and aimed the side at the French, but the Seagull Wing immediately turned its bow and touched his tail at a very fast speed. The 3 frigates were like light birds, circling around the British cruiser, firing a few shots when they had the chance, and using speed to get away when the opponent approached. This is the Ranger tactics formulated by the French naval staff for steam warships. Avoid head-on confrontation, make full use of their own speed and turning advantages, and grind down the powerful but clumsy enemy ships bit by bit. More than 20 minutes later, Hicks' flagship was devastated, especially a 24-pound cannon shell near the starboard waterline. Although the breach was not large, as long as the ship made a large maneuver, seawater would rush in. Hicks suddenly felt a strong sense of fear. Following this trend, he would be sunk sooner or later. He began to regret breaking up the formation to search for the French warship. If the Starry Dream was next to it at this time, the 2 ships could cover each other and should not fall into such a passive situation. In fact, he didn't know that because the French Navy's steam warships had been in service for too short a time. From the captain to the crew, they had not yet mastered the Ranger tactics, otherwise his ship would have been sunk 10 minutes ago. However, the French frigate still had plenty of time to play with him. Slowly 11 nautical miles outside the port of Marseille, the flagship of the British Mediterranean fleet, the Victory, floated on the sea like a towering mountain. This first-class battleship, which is over 70 meters long, displaces more than 3,000 tons, and is equipped with 108 cannons, is the pride of the British Royal Navy. Its combat effectiveness ranks among the top 3 in the world. At this time, in the spacious officers' meeting room of the Victory, Lord Hood, the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean fleet, was looking over the order just sent by the British Navy with a dark face. Your Excellency has failed to fulfill his due responsibilities, resulting in merchant ships being attacked many times in the Mediterranean Sea. Chapter 773 Goodbye Toulon. The Admiralty has decided to allocate 2 more battleships, the Conqueror and the Spartan Guard, as well as 8 other 4th and 5th level battleships to the Mediterranean fleet. Please ensure complete control of the Mediterranean. Lord Hood took a deep breath and closed the document. In the past month, 11 merchant ships have been destroyed or captured by the French fleet. Although the French Mediterranean fleet was blocked in the port of Toulon by him, and only some frigates were harassing in the Mediterranean, his own escort fleet was completely unable to stop their killing. He picked up the report next to him. It was a detailed process of the recent attack on British merchant ships, reported by the escorting warships. Obviously, the French were equipped with a new type of frigate with very fast speed, which posed a huge challenge to his escort mission in the Mediterranean. Fortunately, the Admiralty allocated another batch of warships to him. After these ships are in place, the Mediterranean fleet will have 33 main battleships above level 3, 44th and 5th level ships, and nearly 70 frigates. The French fleet in the port of Marseille only has 17 main battleships and 21 4th and 5th level ships. Even if the 9 main battleships and 12 4th and 5th level ships of the Spanish Mediterranean fleet are added, the overall scale is far less than that of their side. In fact, in history, the number of warships of the Franco-Spanish joint fleet at this time was the same as that of the United Kingdom, or even slightly more. But Joseph has been controlling the number of new large warships built by the French Navy in recent years, resulting in France having fewer sailing warships than in history. Of course, the French Navy has also been compensated, that is, 23 light of the Mediterranean class steam frigates and 7 of the latest Tunisia class 32 gun steam cruisers. It is these steam warships that have recently turned the Mediterranean upside down. There were footsteps outside the cabin door. Lord Hood put the documents of the Admiralty into his pocket and said to the guards at the door, "Let them in." "Yes, General." Then, 6 or 7 senior officers of the British Mediterranean fleet filed in. Seeing that the commander-in-chief had arrived first, they all had a bad feeling in their hearts. Lord Hood motioned for them to sit down and went straight to the point. Merchant ships have been attacked repeatedly recently, and the Admiralty attaches great importance to it. It seems that we have to adjust our combat strategy. Major General Collingwood said, "General, most of these French frigates use the port of Bizerte in Tunisia as their home port. We can send the Marines to attack there, or block the French warships in the port." Colonel Horatio Nelson immediately shook his head. "I don't think this is the best strategy. From the intelligence we have, those French frigates are very fast. They can easily move to other ports, such as Tripoli or Ajaccio, before we reach Bizerte. These light warships are indeed difficult to track, so we should focus on providing effective escort." Major General Hotham looked at Lord Hood. "General, in fact, we don't need to deploy so many warships near Toulon. We can allocate some third-level ships and cooperate with a large number of cruisers to form a powerful squadron to perform escort missions, so that the French light warships dare not approach at will. The firepower and protection of the third-level ships are very strong. Even if they are left there for the frigates to attack, the latter's artillery will find it difficult to penetrate their hulls. They are the core combat power in naval battles." Hood nodded slightly. The Admiralty has just allocated him 2 main battleships and 8 4th and 5th level ships. He has sufficient funds to build a squadron. However, in this way, British merchant ships have to leave the port in batches, so that the squadron can provide effective cover. Just as he was hesitating, an officer knocked on the door and handed him a battle report. "General, our ship was attacked in the Barbary Sea 3 days ago." Hood unfolded the battle report and his face changed immediately. The Golden Elm was sunk. It was written that Hick's escort formation was attacked. Not only did they lose 3 merchant ships, but most importantly, the Royal Navy's 5th level cruiser was sunk. The first warship sunk since the war began was actually a British one, and it was a 5th level ship. Hood continued to read the report. Since there were no witnesses, no one knew how the Golden Elm was sunk. It only said that 3 high-speed frigates had attacked merchant ships before. When other British officers finished reading the battle report, they all frowned. Major General Hotham said, "Perhaps a French battleship slipped away, or maybe it was the Spanish fleet who did it." Lord Hood said with a serious face, "No matter what, we must fight back." Colonel Nelson pondered. "General, only if the main force of our fleet is sailing in the Mediterranean can we better defend against enemy sneak attacks and even seize the opportunity to annihilate their attack fleet." Hood frowned. "Then what about the French fleet in Toulon port?" Nelson smiled. Perhaps, only by letting them come out of the anchorage can we find an opportunity. Major General Collingwood subconsciously said, "What opportunity do you mean?" "The opportunity to annihilate the main French fleet. Toulon, the southeastern border of France." Napoleon handed the latest war report from the General Staff to Major Victor beside him and sighed. His Royal Highness the Dauphin defeated the Austrians in Wavre. He looked at the Catibona Pass, which was invisible from here, and said sadly, "It has been half a month here, and Bolu still hasn't crossed the Alps." After he realized that Bolu was planning to attack Toulon, he withdrew his troops and prepared to launch a fierce attack on the Austrian army after it passed the Alps. But the Austrians' logistics were too slow, and they have not been able to enter France until now. Victor smiled and said, "If we had attacked Nizza directly, we might have reached Albenga by now." Napoleon shook his head. "Then we will have to have a decisive battle in Sardinia and Bolu's main force, and the logistics supply line will cross the Catibona Pass." "Yes, so we have to continue to be patient." As Victor was speaking, a Corsican cavalryman suddenly galloped over and saluted Napoleon. "Commander." An Austrian corps appeared on the west side of the pass, with about 4,000 people. Napoleon's eyes lit up immediately. "Finally here. Order the Moulin Corps to launch an attack as planned." "Yes, Commander." Victor was a little surprised and said, "You said before that you would let the Austrians enter Toulon before having a decisive battle. Wouldn't it make them alert if you attack now?" Napoleon smiled slightly. "No, this way Bolu will be able to attack Toulon with confidence." Chapter 774, The Emperor's Intuition. Seeing Victor's puzzled expression, Napoleon asked, "Do you remember Marshal Bolu's age?" "Ah, he seems to be 69 years old." "Yes, 69. Napoleon nodded. "He has fought for more than 50 years, and is very experienced. If he finds that his front army has not encountered any resistance after entering France, he will definitely become extremely vigilant. On the contrary, if we launch a fierce counterattack, he will firmly believe that we can easily occupy Toulon." Victor suddenly realized, indeed, victory will urge the Austrians to advance quickly. He suddenly thought of the current deployment of the Italian front and reminded, "Lieutenant Colonel Buvanaba, is our current position too far back?" Napoleon deployed all the French troops to the west of Nice. This means that the easternmost side of the Toulon province has no defensive forces. Nice is the largest city on the east side of Toulon, and this is the best place to defend. Napoleon said, "The deeper the Austrian army goes into Toulon, the longer its front line will be, which will be more conducive to our finding weak points to attack. Besides, this will also allow Monaco to pay more military expenses." Monaco is a small principality in the southeast of France, located 10 kilometers east of Nice, at the foot of the Alps. If Austria wants to attack Nice, it must first attack Monaco. Although the Principality of Monaco is a French protectorate, it still has a great deal of independence. Facing the threat of Austria this time, it will inevitably use all its national strength to resist, and will inevitably be more closely tied to France in the future. Victor still hesitated. "Lieutenant Colonel Buvanaba, if the Austrians enter Nice, they can go north to Brest from here. And our army has not set up a defense line north of Toulon. No, you don't need to worry." Napoleon said very confidently, "Bolu will definitely continue to the west and attack the port of Toulon. Can you tell me your basis? Because the British will ask Bolu to do this, where our Mediterranean fleet is parked." Napoleon said, and tapped his forehead with his index finger, "And my intuition. Will it be?" Napoleon smiled and patted him on the back. "You'd better use this time to urge the Toulouse Legion to prepare winter clothes. Maybe we will cross the Alps soon. You know, the snow on the top of the mountain has not melted at this time of the year." Eastern Monaco, the town of Lavato. After destroying the French sentry tower at the Catibona Pass, the Austrian vanguard Provera Corps was immediately attacked by the Provence frontier guards. The Austrians were caught off guard at first, and lost dozens of people, but soon, under the command of Major General Provera at the front line, they repelled the hundreds of French border guards. Then, in accordance with the orders of Marshal Bolu, Provera, with the Grenadier Battalion as the vanguard, quickly advanced westward until the town of Lavato on the border of Monaco, where they encountered the French army that had reorganized its defense line again. and 500 soldiers of the Monaco Royal Guard. Provera immediately showed the demeanor of a famous Austrian general. On the one hand, he mobilized an infantry regiment to cooperate with the Grenadier Battalion to attack the defensive positions of the French and Monaco coalition forces, and on the other hand, he sent cavalry around to the north of Monte Carlo, the capital of Monaco, and headed straight for the castle of the Grand Duke of Monaco. As expected, the Monaco guards panicked and hastily withdrew to Monte Carlo to protect their king. The 800 French border guards in Lavato were unable to support themselves. They were defeated by the Austrian grenadiers in less than 2 hours, and fled to Monte Carlo. Provera rested in the town for one night, and the next day he ordered all 5,000 soldiers under his command to attack Monaco in full force. Yesterday afternoon, his army had all passed the Catibona Pass. In fact, the area of Monaco is about the same as that of Nice. 5,000 troops can almost plow its land neatly. The French and Monaco coalition forces only fired a few shots symbolically and covered the Grand Duke of Monaco's escape to Nice. At the same time, Monaco's diplomats also formally requested Paris to send troops for protection. However, the French army seemed to be defending the Brest line, and Taulin's troops were very limited. It was not until Provera's army arrived at the city of Nice that the French barely mobilized 1,000 people. San Remo, a city in southwestern Sardinia, in the headquarters of the Austrian-Italian front, Bolu listened to the military intelligence report from the front line, and a smile appeared on his face. The French did not expect that he would march from the south, and the weak defense of Taulin was enough to prove this. Provera easily defeated the French defenders and successfully occupied Nice. At present, he can use this place as a base to launch an attack on the Taulin fortress. He looked at the troop deployment on the wall and said to the herald, "Order Argenteuil and Vucasivi to speed up the march. They must pass the Alps before noon tomorrow. Tell them not to let down their guard. Set up camp immediately after entering France and send out cavalry for reconnaissance. Wait until the Central Army has all passed the mountain pass before continuing to advance." "Yes, Marshal." Bolu waited for the herald to leave, thought for a while, and said to the staff, "Report the victory to His Majesty the Emperor, and say that our army is making good progress in the direction of Italy. When the news reaches Vienna, Taulin should have been occupied. Also, urge the British to deliver logistical supplies to the port of La Condamine. We need to prepare supplies for the attack on Brest." The port of La Condamine is a small port in Monaco. 5 days later, Provera's corps left Nice and launched an attack on the town of Cannes, 11 kilometers to the west. At the same time, Sebottendorf on the left wing of the Austrian army began to besiege Vence, an important town in the south-central part of Taulin. Provera put away the telescope, looked back at the marching column, and said to the herald, "Let these lazy guys go faster, and try to enter Cannes tonight to spend the night." He had conducted repeated reconnaissance before, and confirmed that there were no French troops around Nice. Along the way, he only needed to plant the flag in the town to complete the occupation. However, it seemed that God had felt that he had given him too many military exploits, and needed to be tempered. A cavalryman came to salute him and said, "General, the French defense line was found outside Cannes, with more than 3,000 people." Provera frowned. Where did this army come from? Looking at the flag, "It should be the Montpellier Corps, General." Provera nodded. If Montpellier came by forced march, it would take about a week. He immediately ordered, "The French should be very tired. Attack immediately." "Yes, General." At noon that day, Sebottendorf also encountered thousands of French troops in Vence. He also gave the order to attack without hesitation. Chapter 775. Everything is as promised. The two Austrian generals thought they were cautious enough. Behind them were nearly 60,000 Austrian and Sardinian troops, enough to sweep across southeastern France, but they still carried out reconnaissance and formation meticulously according to the requirements of Marshal Bolu. There was nothing unusual. The only thing left was to launch an attack. The little defensive force that the French desperately mobilized would be crushed by them in a day or two at most. On the high ground 3 kilometers northwest of Cannes town, Marquis Peche heard the faint sound of artillery in the distance, and looked at Victor beside him with great concern. "Major Victor, the enemy's attack seems to be very fierce. Should we go to reinforce?" Although Victor was a little nervous, He still shook his head and said, "No, the commander asked us to wait here, and we must not leave without permission." He was commanding 2 regiments, that is, more than 3,000 soldiers, but he could only watch the 2 regiments of the Lion Legion in Caen's town resist the attack of more than 5,000 people from the Austrian Province Legion. After a few minutes, the Marquis de Pesce, as the head of the Lion Corps, could not help but say again, "Major Victor, if this continues, the town of Caen will probably be breached." Victor just looked in the direction of the artillery fire in silence. Lieutenant Colonel Napoleon had assured him that Ramadia would be able to defend Caen 5 kilometers northwest of Vence. Joubert also looked at the direction of Vence, where the smoke was rising, and said to Junot beside him, "Lieutenant Colonel Bouvanaber's deployment is indeed very strange." Junot seemed very relaxed. "Don't be nervous, he is the second most talented officer I have ever seen. He can always smell the enemy's movements sensitively and choose the most effective means of response. Needless to say, the first military genius is naturally the founder of the new French army, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Joubert exhaled. "The Austrian army's Subduing Corps has more than 10,000 soldiers, and the Corsican Corps defending Vence plus Baron d'Effel's Toulouse army, a total of only 6,500 people. I hope they can really hold on." Yes, the Joubert Corps also received orders to wait here and be on standby. No matter what the situation in Vence was, they were not allowed to move without authorization. At this time, outside the city of Vence, Baron d'Effer was listening to his subordinates reporting the battle situation with a serious expression. The Marken camp lost more than half of its company. Captain Charles' cavalry company blocked the flank raid, but suffered 21 casualties. Captain Keelana's infantry company suffered heavy losses. I request you to send reserve reinforcement. D'Effer only adjusted the defensive formation, but did not send a single soldier to join the defense line. Lieutenant Colonel Bouvanaber asked him to hold on here for 5 days, and he must allocate troops reasonably. At present, the 2,000 soldiers on the defense line can probably hold on until after 3 p.m. By then, we will see the morale and decide whether to replace them. Fortunately, Lieutenant Colonel Bouvanaber left him an artillery company equipped with 6 cannons. These artillerymen were trained by the Lieutenant Colonel in Corsica. They have excellent shooting skills and can always fire shells at the most densely populated areas of the enemy. Thanks to their outstanding performance, Vence was able to barely stabilize the situation. However, the number of Austrian troops attacking was too large. In the morning, the number of casualties in his corps was close to 200. This was simply the most difficult battle he had ever fought since he joined the army. Finally, under the constant prayers of Baron d'Effel, the sun slowly disappeared into the horizon. The painful groans of the wounded soldiers were heard from the camp of the Toulouse Corps from time to time. However, they still defended Vence, even at the cost of 370 casualties. In fact, the casualties of the Austrian army on the opposite side were even more serious than theirs. Although the Toulouse Corps was only a traditional corps that was looked down upon in France, its combat effectiveness was still higher than that of the Austrian army. In addition, it was a defensive battle. They occupied a favorable position in advance and built several breastworks, so they also played a good exchange ratio. At dawn the next day, the brutal battle continued. After a day of fierce attack yesterday, the Subduing Corps only pushed the front line forward more than 100 meters. Austrian Army Command. Bolu frowned as he read the battle report, somewhat surprised by the tenacity shown by the French army. The French could have easily transferred their forces back to the Toulon fortress for defense, but they unexpectedly held on to the 2 isolated towns. He looked at the map on the table. Vence and Caen blocked the west of Nice, preventing his army from continuing to advance to the port of Toulon. He stroked his cane and pondered, is the French planning something big in the port of Toulon? The staff officer next to him continued, Marshal, perhaps we can bypass Vence, continue westward from the river valley further north, and then head straight for the port of Toulon. Bolu nodded slightly. Order Subduing. If Vence is not captured after 3 days, let him bypass it and surround the Toulon fortress. He looked at the map again. As for Caen, we must conquer it and open up the supply line to the west. Let Caretto lead his grenadiers battalion to reinforce Provera. Give them a week. Yes, Marshal. 3 days later. Siebotendorf looked through a telescope at the two unused breastworks outside Nice and the cannons that were constantly spewing flames near the high ground south of the city. He had no choice but to follow Bolu's orders. He turned his head to the herald and said, "Gather the troops, bypass the town of St. Gened from the North Valley tomorrow morning, and then head to the port of Toulon." Baron Defi was writing a request for help to General de Maupin, the commander-in-chief of the Italian front. The task Napoleon gave him was too difficult, so he had to complain to his superiors. At this moment, the artillery fire from the Austrian side gradually stopped outside the town of Cannes. Reincarnated, the commander of the Grenadiers battalion who came to reinforce, frowned at the sand table. There were only 3 days left before the deadline given to them by Marshal Bolu, but the French showed no signs of collapse. Chiaretto suddenly noticed that the French defense line was retreating and gradually formed a diagonal line leaning to the east. He pointed a thin stick to the west of Cannes. "If we can sneak around here and launch an attack, it will be difficult for the French defense line to take care of it. You see, they have lost the cover on the northwest side." Proper's eyes lit up immediately, and he nodded and said, "You have keenly found the key to ending this battle. Then we will try to move to the northwest tonight." In the bushes, Jubilee yawned. After these few days of tension and anxiety, he has begun to get used to this kind of boring waiting. He suddenly frowned, feeling that something was wrong today. The sound of artillery in the distance seemed much weaker than before. He immediately perked up and waved to the cavalry captain, "Go and see what happened." More than an hour later, two rangers hurried back, panting, "Captain, the Austrian army has left Vence and is heading towards us." End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.